Okay, the Rules Committee will come to order. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to honor the life and the service of our colleague, Congressman Donald McEachin, who passed away last night. He was an exceptional public servant, fighting for the people of Virginia's 4th Congressional District since his election in 2016, and served as a member of Virginia's General Assembly before that. Those who knew Don well always pointed to his work as a fierce champion for social justice and a protector of the environment. He will be dearly missed, and our prayers go out to his family during this difficult time. Today we're going to consider 3 bills. H.R. 3372, the One-Stop Shop Community Reentry Program Act, helps create centralized centers where formerly incarcerated individuals can access reentry services and other critical resources all under one roof. This common-sense bill will better support those who were formerly incarcerated and reduce reoffense rates, and it should pass with broad bipartisan support. H.R. 6878, the Pregnant Women in Custody Act, establishes care standards for how federal facilities treat pregnant and postpartum women in custody. Incarcerated women deserve access to prenatal and postpartum care that can help prevent maternal health complications and ensure that newborns have a healthy start in life. This is a good bill that also deserves support from all of our colleagues. H.R. 8876, the Jackie Walorski Maternal and Child Home Visiting Reauthorization Act, reauthorizes the transformative maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting program, a program that provides in-home services to improve maternal and child health, family safety and stability, child development, and school readiness. There's no better way to honor the memory of our colleague, Congresswoman Jackie Walorski, who is a dear friend of mine and who worked tirelessly to improve the lives of children. This reauthorization bill should pass the House with flying colors. Quite frankly, I mean, all of these bills either have passed overwhelmingly before or should pass overwhelmingly and should be under suspension. But we're told that there may be problems on the other side, and I don't quite get it, but whatever. These are important bills that we ought to move forward with, and let's get them done. But again, they should be suspension bills, and again, I hope they get suspension majorities. But I guess we have no assurance of that, so we have to go this route. With that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Cole.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to associate myself with your very appropriate remarks about our friend from Virginia and Mr. McEachin, and extend my sympathy to his family and certainly to Virginia. He was a wonderful member of Congress, and he genuinely will be missed. We're here today on 3 bills. The first I'll discuss, H.R. 8876, is the Jackie Walorski Maternal and Child Home Visiting Reauthorization Act of 2022. Broadly, this bill, which has overwhelming bipartisan support, reauthorizes and provides funding for the maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting program through 2027. I can think of no better tribute to Representative Walorski, our dear friend who departed us far too soon. And while I wish she were here with us today, this bill is a reminder to us all that she will live on in our memory. Our other 2 bills arise out of the Judiciary Committee. Both of these measures have Republican support, and indeed I note that Mr. Reschenthaler is the Republican lead on both of these bills. The first of these bills I'll discuss, H.R. 3372, the One-Stop Shop Community Reentry Program Act, would establish a grant program to provide support for nonprofit organizations providing community reentry services to formerly incarcerated individuals. The second bill, H.R. 6878, the Pregnant Women in Custody Act, would provide additional resources to attend to the health concerns of pregnant women who are incarcerated or otherwise in government custody. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and hearing their perspectives as we consider these measures. Before I conclude, Mr. Chairman, I will note I'm more than a little concerned that we are not meeting on other critical items today. Before the end of this Congress, we still need to pass a final bipartisan bicameral agreement on the annual National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, which we've done each year for the past 61 years. We need to reach a final agreement on the full-year appropriations bills for fiscal year 2023. At least we fall into a year-long continuing resolution, which would be a bad outcome for everyone involved. With these and other pressing issues, it's disappointing that the Rules Committee is not yet meeting on these items today. The clock's ticking, and the longer we dawdle on these important matters, the harder it becomes to finish all the business facing the 117th Congress before time runs out. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now would like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 3372, the One-Stop Shop Community Reentry Program Act of 2021, and H.R. 6878, the Pregnant Women in Custody Act. Subcommittee Chairwoman Jackson Lee, Representative Bishop, we are delighted that you are here. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Subcommittee Chairwoman Jackson Lee.
Chairman McGovern, thank you so very much, and Ranking Member Cole, thank you. Since this is a season of being thankful, let me first of all indicate my thankfulness for the life of the late Congressman Keaton, and indicate that as a friend, I am deeply saddened by his loss, and deeply saddened by the loss to his constituents, but most of all his family. He was passionate in his service. He worked across the aisle, and he was, in fact, and will continue to be remembered as a great American. I thank you for allowing me to do that. And then might I thank the members of the Rules Committee as we come toward the end of the 117th Congress for all of the hours, days, minutes, and seconds that you have listened to members and helped move this engine of governance. You are a key and important role that you play, and I have had the pleasure of meeting up with a lot of you in this room over many years, and I do appreciate your work. Let me quickly, and thank Mr. Bishop for his presence here today. Let me quickly speak to two bills that I truly believe should move quickly, and hope that we will counter anyone's concern. One-Stop Shop, H.R. 3372 of 2021, and H.R. 6878, the Pregnant Woman in Custody Act of 2022. H.R. 3372, as I try to summarize very quickly, is a public safety-minded bill that would create a grant program within the Department of Justice to deal with local communities. We have an infrastructure of doing this. On the federal level, there is not that. And so a grant program is created. The centralized centers open pursuant to this bill would offer those leaving incarceration the resources necessary to successfully rejoin, reintegrate in our communities. We know that the difficulty of reincarceration and crime comes from those who are, in fact, repeaters. This one-stop shop would be a program that more than 600,000 people who return to their communities each year after serving time in state and federal prisons, as do nearly 9 million people from county, and more than 2.5 million people complete parole or probation each year. This is what the program would do. Individuals with criminal convictions face daunting challenges. The overwhelming majority of those released are given minimum preparation and adequate assistance to get back on their feet. A criminal conviction may limit their prospects, and we've seen it in our own districts, of public housing, employment, access to social services. Even having a minor criminal conviction may erect substantial barriers and far-reaching collateral consequences, due in part to the difficulty of overcoming these barriers. 5 out of 6 people who have spent time in a state prison will be arrested for a new crime within 9 years of their release. Policies that are designed to improve reentry outcomes have broad bipartisan support, as demonstrated by the passage of the First Step Act that came out of our committee and had bipartisan support, which incentivizes education and recidivism reduction programs for people in the federal system. While the First Step Act and other initiatives have been successful at the federal level, the majority of returning citizens and the majority of incarcerated persons are in the state and local facilities and exiting state and local facilities, and there is a need for a more comprehensive approach to the challenge of reentry. I'd like to think small communities, villages, rural areas. An example of the type of community reentry center supported by this legislation is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where community groups offer a comprehensive model of reentry. The services offered through the Tulsa Reentry One Stop has significantly reduced recidivism and increased employment. In 2015, 77% of the individuals who successfully completed their reintegration program were still employed after exiting the program. This legislation would model this and would establish a grant program to support community reentry centers and ensure that support is made available for all individuals the moment they are released. Support would include transportation, I hear it often, housing, skills training. Additionally, a one-stop community reentry would assist in obtaining identification, I hear it often, you do too, certainly from the families, and help in applying for what eligible public benefits they have, which may include veterans benefit. Reentering individuals have formal reentry plans would be able to find case management and court-directed wraparound support at the one-stop community reentry centers. In addition to the one-stop community reentry, this bill authorizes a second mechanism, really for small communities, to assist reentering individuals in communities that don't have a large enough number of reentering individuals to maintain a standalone community. They'll get a 24/7 call-in line. Hopefully that will be helpful to them and make this applicable to our rural and small communities. So I applaud my colleague, Congresswoman Karen Bass, for drafting and championing this legislation. She has, of course, been, if you will, moved and elevated to become the mayor of the largest city in the nation, as I understand LA's profile. And we thank her for her leadership in this interest, in this area. Reentry services like these are going to be very important, and I believe this bill addresses questions that are important. Let me briefly say that the manager's amendment makes minor technical changes in order to incorporate the Department of Justice feedback. The second bill, pregnant women in custody, there's no doubt that this is a bipartisan bill, and it would establish federal policies to prohibit the use of restrictive housing on incarcerated pregnant women and develop a national standard of care to address pregnancy-related needs of incarcerated women, including access to prenatal and post-delivery care and support. We found in our hearings that in some prisons, they have handcuffed, they have feet cuffed, they have tied, if you will, with various containment items, women who are pregnant. While women are the fastest growing segment of the incarcerated population in the United States, discussions about criminal justice reform often exclude them. The United States is the second highest highest rate of women incarcerated in the world, with 64 women per 100,000 in custody, and there are an estimated 58,000 admissions of pregnant women into jails and prisons every year. We want to set the standard. In data compiled by the GAO, there were at least 1,200 pregnant women in custody of the U.S. Marshals Service, 524 pregnant women in the Bureau of Prisons custody between 2017 and 2019. H.R. 6878 would require BOP to collect data on the healthcare needs of pregnant women so that we may better understand the challenges of incarcerated women face. The bill would also require GAO to study state and local corrections facilities to understand the services and protections they need. Information saves lives. Pregnancy is not easy, and we've seen a high rate of maternal mortality. Let's not have it in our system and on our watch. In the GAO study, this bill would ensure incarcerated pregnant women receive vital prenatal health care and postpartum support. Pregnant women often lacked access to appropriate nutrition while incarcerated, and the use of restrictive housing and equipment can have detrimental effects on a woman's health as well as the health of her baby. It's important that women of color are known to be disproportionately impacted by incarceration. They also face higher risks of miscarriage and maternal mortality. The bill would ensure that BOP and the Marshals Service protect the health and safety of incarcerated women throughout their pregnancy, when they deliver their child, as they recover, because women serving time in federal and state custody, they deserve to receive proper care. Setting standards for their treatment of incarcerated women in federal custody will set a standard for state and local, and as we endeavor to navigate a new landscape for reproductive freedom across the country, let me also say that it complements legislation that I've introduced and passed that would give an opportunity for infants to be kept for a period of time when a woman is in for a long period of time and gives birth. We must never forget women like Andrea Circle Bear, who entered federal custody while pregnant, contracted COVID-19 while in BOP's care, then later gave birth while on a ventilator and died without ever seeing her child. Better care could have been given. Let us make sure women receive proper health care and humane treatment while they're incarcerated, and let us not have any more Andrea Circle Bear. H.R. 6878 will support the health and safety of pregnant women, and again, I thank Congresswoman Karen Bass for the steadfast commitment to addressing this important issue. The manager's amendment makes one technical change to the budget provision and restores the language related to contraception to the text as introduced last Congress. This change comes from discussions in the Senate to ensure passage of the companion bill. Again, I thank the committee for its longstanding work, and I'm available for any questions. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Congressman Bishop. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lee. As to the first bill, H.R. 3372, of course, it, as said, authorizes the Attorney General to provide grants to community-based nonprofits to operate one-stop reentry centers. The point of contention is that the Department of Justice already does exactly what this bill would require it to do. The Second Chance Act of 2007, reauthorized by Congress and signed into law by President Trump, and the First Step Act of 2018, provides comprehensive assistance to individuals in transition from prison back to the community. So this Reentry Assistance Authority already exists. And in fact, last Congress, the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security held a hearing entitled Returning Citizens, Challenges and Opportunities for Reentry. The majority's own briefing memo for that hearing highlighted, as an example, the Somerset County Day Reporting Center in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. The center calls itself a, quote, community-based correctional program that has been designed to provide services for its participants at one location, close quote. This is the exact type of program envisioned by H.R. 3372. And indeed, the center's program has received a grant from the Justice Department's Bureau of Justice Assistance. In fact, the name of that grant is Smart Supervision, Reducing Prison Populations, Saving Money, and Creating Safer Communities. H.R. 3372 is duplicative of efforts found in the Second Chance Act, under which nonprofit entities are eligible for grant funds. While we all want successful reentry programs to reduce recidivism, it does not help. In fact, it hurts because it deprives the end user of the resources to create duplicative and additional bureaucracy in the process. Indeed, the question might be begged, can the nonprofit that I've cited or that Ms. Jackson-Lee made reference to receive grants under both of the duplicative programs? Where we should be spending our limited time here, instead of passing duplicative legislation to provide this, is to address the rampant crime epidemic in America's cities, rejecting lenient soft-on-crime policies and encouraging prosecutors to actually enforce the law. I'll turn briefly to H.R. 6878, the Pregnant Women in Custody Act. Each year, an estimated 58,000 pregnant women pass through jails and prisons in the United States. This bill would expand on existing programs within the Bureau of Prisons to provide certain health and wellness-related services for pregnant, incarcerated women. The legislation will help these women receive necessary medical care, nutrition, and support while in federal custody. The bill builds upon President Trump's leadership in the First Step Act, which prohibited the use of restraints on pregnant women in federal custody. H.R. 6878 would prohibit pregnant women in federal custody from being placed in restrictive housing unless their behavior poses a serious and immediate risk of physical harm. The bill also expands data reporting on the health needs of pregnant incarcerated women and requires guidelines for the treatment of incarcerated women during pregnancy, labor, and postpartum recovery. Certainly, all of us believe that pregnant, incarcerated women should be well cared for in federal custody. However, there is a note of concern that some members have with this bill, that it could require the Bureau of Prisons to provide abortifacients to pregnant inmates. Section 4 of the bill requires that, quote, the Bureau of Prisons, at an inmate's request, shall provide contraception, close quote. But the word contraception is not defined in the bill and could potentially include abortifacients. Internal Bureau of Prisons policy does not define contraception, but it does state that, quote, the medical indication and appropriateness of prescribing birth control in a correctional environment ordinarily is limited to hormone replacement therapy. Because the word contraception is not defined in internal policy and not in the statute, not in the bill proposed, the ambiguity leaves open the reasonable interpretation that the term contraception could be construed to include abortifacients or other substances that induce an abortion. Hopefully, we may get some clarity on that from Representative Jackson-Lee during this hearing. I request an open rule on both bills so that all members can provide valuable amendments and improve these pieces of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I have no questions. Mr. Cole?
Well, I just want to thank our witnesses for their testimony, but I have no questions either, Mr. Chairman.
Mrs. Torres?
No questions.
Dr. Burgess?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I just want to add acknowledgement of the loss of our colleague from Energy and Commerce, Mr. McEachern of Virginia. Truly one of the sharpest legal minds I've ever encountered. And just his unfailing desire to see things were right in a markup, even though he may not agree with the position for which he was arguing. He wanted us to get it right. And I was always impressed by that character in him. Mr. Bishop, I'm so glad you brought up the Second Chance Act, because when I read through this legislation that we're considering today, I had deja vu. Mr. Davis and our former colleague, Elsie Hastings, had the Second Chance Act several years ago. It was passed. I went to the press conference, actually got criticized politically at home for being at a press conference with Elsie Hastings, but that's a separate development. But yeah, I thought we dealt with a lot of these problems with the Second Chance Act. And I guess my question for you is, do you have, here's a problem. You pass a bill through a legitimate authorizing committee, gets an appropriation from the Appropriations Committee. What kind of oversight then is continued into the agency, in this case the Department of Justice, to see that these grants actually are awarded and that they make a meaningful impact? The old phrase, a difference in order to be a difference has to make a difference, kind of comes to mind. And the reason I bring that up is after the passage of the Second Chance Act, which I supported, I could never find any evidence that it had helped people who were incarcerated in Tarrant County, Texas. And that was one of the primary reasons that I supported it at the beginning. So do you do that type of oversight in the Judiciary Committee to see that those dollars get where they're supposed to go?
Well, I'll say, Mr. Burgess, that in the time that I've sat there, I think we've done less of that than we should. I believe one of the things that should happen in the 118th Congress is far more robust oversight to determine that. But certainly, this agency is left with a circumstance like this, once the legislation's passed, to rationalize it all, to try to make it work without inefficiencies. You would imagine, though, you've got to have reporting lines, you've got to have the various pieces of legislation all reckoned with, and so I think it builds in, and the American people are not unaccustomed to seeing the kind of inefficiency, the kind of consumption of resources that actually deprives Americans of the help that they need, because we're burning it up in the federal government by less thought than we should provide about how things are duplicated. So I certainly, the first approach, the best approach would be not to duplicate it. But if we proceed to duplicate it, then yes, we ought to have robust oversight from this body to try to make sure that the agency is doing the best in its capacity to rationalize and to make things and harmonize different pieces of legislation that unfortunately do the same thing.
Well, that's the old saying, if you don't have time to do it right, when are you going to find time to do it over? I think the reason we see duplicative legislation is because there's never the follow-through with the original legislation that was authorized and then appropriated. And look, we're kind of at a unique time in the economy when there are more jobs than people available to fill the jobs. And this should be a time, in my opinion, where we make a real strong effort to get people who have somehow been left off the ladders of success. Here's a way in. And that's what we should be opening up. Look, I'll support this bill when it comes to the floor. I've supported it. Is my frustration as we keep doing the same things over and over again, and we're not really helping people, and that's a waste of the taxpayer dollar. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Chairman,
Now I'll yield back.
Can I just respond briefly?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Burgess. Certainly, I think you have highlighted what may be a misconstruing of one stop. One stop goes on the angle of ensuring the access of the individuals. First step, obviously I was on Judiciary, supported that extensively, worked with our good friend as he worked in a bipartisan manner, along with other members who are not in Congress at this point. But in any event, and of course, Second Chance, Danny Davis is in the room. We have embraced his efforts for decades, the work that he's done. This specifically is geared to the consumer, to let the consumer, because that's really the problem. The problem is that person who is out, has benefited from First Step, may come out as a welder. This effort would be a widespread effort. It would go beyond the great work in Tulsa, beyond the great work in Pennsylvania, and let this be an opportunity for all to have one stop, to know where to go, to have it community-based, to be in urban and rural villages and hamlets, and so it would direct itself more to the individual. And I think I think what you will see is that there will be a benefit when those services are close to the consumer, and to make it better. And I yield back. Thank you so very much.
As I would just add, I share your enthusiasm for the intent, but I got to tell you, my ability to have trust in the agencies that are going to be charged with implementing this and writing the rules, that's where it falls off. And again, you all in the Judiciary Committee, we're depending upon you to do the follow-through on this and make sure it's correct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, and I agree with Dr. Burgess on Mr. McEachin. One of the smartest, toughest guys I think I've ever met. Always had a smile despite the pain of his illness over the last few years. And, you know, I think all of us should try to model that kind of an attitude and approach that he had. And it's a sad day in losing him. I just want to thank the two of you for your testimony. Obviously, Ms. Jackson Lee sold me at hello. And really, I thought these should be suspension types of bills, but appreciate your testimony. I'll yield back to the chair.
Mr. Reauthorization.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I'm not going to have many more opportunities to do this, I want to say I associate my remarks with Mr. Perlmutter's.
Good for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks to both the witnesses for coming in. I really appreciate it. I just want to say it was a privilege to work with Representative Karen Bass on both these pieces of legislation. I'm very proud of them, and I think they're both necessary. I think we've talked about the merits of both bills extensively. So for the sake of time, we'd just like to say again, thanks for coming in. I hope these pass. They should pass overwhelmingly, and they're needed. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just want to applaud Ms. Jackson Lee for her leadership and Ms. Bass for her work on this. And I would hope that we can move this as quickly as possible. And I hope it would get, overwhelming, if not unanimous support on the floor. I do want to take a moment also to mourn the terrible loss of Donald McEachin, who was just a model member in his passionate commitment to the people he represented from Virginia, and he will be sorely and sharply missed by all of us in the days ahead. And I wanted to send love and condolences to his family. I yield back.
Yeah, Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I just want to say that our hallway is very lonely. It's empty, and there's no Christmas decorations.
I'm a small guy, but a big personality.
That's right. And I just wanted to just let you know that we tried our best, and we miss your display.
I'll come back.
Okay. And, with that, I just wanted to just mention a little bit, just Mr. Bishop had mentioned talking about the cost of expanding government and the duplicativeness of some of this, and that is my concern. I mean, obviously, support the intent of it, but, as we continue to add more and more programs without going back and looking at them, it's one of the things that I've dealt with, a lot during my career in public service, that we have to go back and look at those programs so that we can either, expand them if they're working or contract them if they're not, but we have an obligation to the taxpayer to look at these things, and so I appreciate your comments on the duplicativeness. And if you have anything else, Mr. Bishop, you wanted to add.
Thank you, Ms. Fischbach. You and I both spent time in the state legislature, and that certainly was something that we spent a great deal of time doing in the North Carolina legislature, was going back and cutting out the underbrush, if you will, things that had piled up over time. And to the point Ms. Jackson Lee articulated, that this is to create sort of something different, to be a one-stop sort of service for those who are transitioning or transferring back into society. And again, that language that I read from the hearing about the grants under the Second Chance Act, it was talking about a grant to a center that calls itself a community-based correctional program that has been designed to provide services for its participants at one location. it was, it seemed to be accomplishing almost precisely the same purpose. So how Congress can make something, if it hasn't happened adequately, if it hasn't served Tarrant County, Texas, served Pennsylvania apparently, but if it's not being done evenly or comprehensively or fulsomely enough, I'm not sure we accomplished the result by telling the bureaucracy again to do the same thing.
Thank you. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add my expressions of sympathy to Mr. McEachin's family and thank him for his long service to the country and to his state, and pass along my my prayers and thoughts with his family. Thank you.
Mr. DeSaulnier. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to share my expressions of condolence and sympathy for the loss of our colleague, Don McEachin, who was just tremendous and particularly a force in the Southeast. Since Mr. Bishop is here, I always like to share with as many people as want to know that we graduated from law school together. I also wanted to share that my great support for all of these bills, and in particular relative to North Carolina, the bill that helps pregnant inmates. North Carolina in 2021, in a bipartisan way in the legislature, passed a similar bill, and I'm so glad that we are going to provide this kind of protection to pregnant inmates. Some of the stories of the indignities and, in fact, torture that they've suffered in custody simply cannot continue. And so, Mr. Chairman, I support all of the bills and the underlying rule, and I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Chairman, a brief comment at the end. Just want to, since I know we'll go to the floor positively, just want to indicate again, we take our responsibility of oversight very seriously, but I can assure you in the work with Congressman Bass and Congressman Restoral that this bill distinctly appeals to getting the information out and getting to the individual consumer who is an incarcerated person. And finally, as it relates to pregnant women, it is more than needed to address this question as the numbers of women rise, as the number of women who are pregnant in the federal system and the state system rise as well. These are important initiatives, and I thank you, and I've finished by indicating my respect for the late Jackie Walorski and her commitment to nutrition and children, and I look forward to that bill passing as well. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Are there any other members who wish to testify on H.R. 33, or any other questions of this panel? Seeing none, you're dismissed. Are there any other members who wish to testify on H.R. 3372 or H.R. 6878? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H.R. 3372 and H.R. 6878. All right. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 8876, the Jackie Walorski Maternal and Child Home Visiting Reauthorization Act of 2022. Subcommittee Chairman Davis and Representative Smith, we're delighted that you are here. And I'll now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Subcommittee Chairman Davis, for any opening remarks you may have.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Maybe it's on. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 8876, the Jackie Walorski Maternal and Child Home Visiting Reauthorization Act of 2022 continues and expands a proven life-changing experience for pregnant women and families with young children. It also honors our friend Jackie Walorski, who loved this program and was deeply involved in crafting this bill before her tragic death. The Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program, or MACV program, funds home visiting models like healthy families, parents, and teachers the Nurse Family Partnership, and over a dozen other evidence-based models proven to improve mother and child health, family safety, and child development. Home visitors and parents work together to make families stronger. The Jackie Walorski Mother and Child Home Visiting Reauthorization Act is critical legislation that would reauthorize McV for 5 years. Over the 5 years, the bill would double our federal investment in evidence-based home visiting, bringing home visiting to more families and communities. This bill would more than double our investment in tribal communities where so many communities need home visiting but have been left out due to lack of funding. It would invest in the critical home visiting workforce because it is the support and relationships that home visitors build with mothers, fathers, and children that make home visiting work. Also, it would ensure that states and territories have reliable, predictable funding and rules so that they can focus on helping families to thrive. In September, the Ways and Means Committee reported this important bill on a unanimous 41-0 vote. The bill is strongly endorsed by dozens of key stakeholders, organizations including the Home Visiting Coalition, which wrote that the bill addresses every request they made in a thoughtful and productive manner. For floor consideration, we intend to ask the Rules Committee to add a simple amendment to fully offset the cost of continuing and expanding McV. The offset will reduce the unspent balance in the Medicare Improvement Fund, a non-controversial spending offset Congress often uses at the end of a session. It is critical that the House take action to ensure that McV can continue helping families, and I would be willing and pleased to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Representative Smith. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cole. The Jackie Walorski Maternal and Child Home Visiting Reauthorization Act of 2022 is an important part of the legacy of our friend and colleague, Jackie Walorski. It is an opportunity to recognize what she supported, what she believed in, and advocated for the most, improving outcomes for vulnerable families and children. Jackie was a devoted public servant who was a champion for McV and especially the Healthy Families Indiana programs she visited with in her district. As ranking member of the Worker and Family Support Subcommittee, Jackie made a tremendous amount of progress working with Representative Danny Davis on this bill prior to her passing. The bill includes many of the areas she felt strongly about, including increasing transparency about outcomes for families and targeting dollars to the neediest communities. In September, we passed this bill out of the Ways and Means Committee on a unanimous bipartisan vote to provide stability for the program and vulnerable families it serves. McV provides critical supports for expecting mothers and new parents through intensive home visiting services. Unlike most federal social welfare programs, we know what outcomes taxpayers can expect from our investments in McV because funding is only provided for models and interventions that have proven results. This program builds on decades of research that proves home visits by a nurse, social worker, or other trained professional during pregnancy and in the first years of a child's life can help prevent child abuse and neglect, support positive parenting, improve maternal and child health, and promote child development and school readiness. I want to highlight a few key parts of this legislation. Our bipartisan legislation reauthorizes McV for 5 years and will serve more moms and babies by growing the capacity of the program in partnership with states. First, by phasing in a state match, we will expand the reach of evidence-based home visiting programs across the country by adding $174 million in new state funding. Second, we target funds to families in poverty by directing 3/4 of additional McV funding based on the number of children under 5 in poverty in each state. Third, the bill improves outcomes reporting so more people will have visibility into the good work being done by home visitors. HHS will implement a state outcomes dashboard so we will have more transparency on program performance measures and clinical indicators to show actual impact on families. The bill also doubles the tribal set-aside from 3% to 6%. Only 28 tribes currently operate programs funded by tribal McVie grants, less than 30% of those that apply. This will result in an increase in both the number of successful tribal community applications for McVie grants and the size of current grants to effective programs. Lastly, we apply lessons learned from the pandemic and allow virtual visits to continue on a limited basis while maintaining McVie's commitment to in-person visits and high evidence standards. I was chairman of the subcommittee and led our efforts the last time we reauthorized McVie. I'm proud to support this legislation named in honor of my late friend, Jackie Walorski, and the extensive work she did to improve and expand access to it for vulnerable families. I want to again thank Chairman Danny Davis for his continued leadership and commitment to this bill. With that, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you both for your testimony. I think this is an important bill, and it is a fitting tribute to our late colleague, Jackie Walorski, who was not only an effective member of this House of Representatives, but a dear friend. And again, I'd like to think this could pass unanimously. So we're told that there's some angst amongst some members, I think in the Freedom Caucus on this bill. Do you know what the concern about this is? I mean, why this is not a suspensionable bill?
I can't speak to the exact concerns. I mean, I think there's some dollars that are involved. Oftentimes it can be construed that way, but I couldn't speak for that.
No, look, I appreciate your support of this bill. Obviously, Chairman Davis, thank you very much. But I think this should be a strong bipartisan vote. But it's just kind of frustrating that we're going through this rule when I think this could be something that could be suspensionable. But hopefully, we'll get a suspension-like vote, and we'll all be happy. But in any event, I yield to my colleague, Mr. Cole.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I want to thank our witnesses today. I certainly will be supporting the bill. I appreciate your work on that, Mr. Chairman, and honestly appreciate the kind words directed at our late friend, who really was a remarkable member of this House and genuinely commanded respect and affection on both sides of the aisle in a way that's quite rare. So she left us far too soon, and I'm very proud that Congress is moving ahead with this tribute to her. And as usual with Jackie, it's not a meaningless tribute. It's something substantive that will improve the lives of literally tens of thousands of people. So well done to all concerned, and certainly to the committee for producing it and bringing it to us in such a bipartisan fashion. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Torres. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Davis mentioned this is offset through the Medicare Improvement Fund. To the extent that you all have both examined that, is this a satisfactory offset for the spending that's being authorized?
Well, Dr. Burgess, I think that that would be sufficient in terms of an offset. It's not often used, but the resources are there. And of course, we know the impact of the act will be so great until there will be negligible cost, if we're thinking in terms of what the cost of the bill is going to be.
Well, I agree. Sometimes the cost of doing nothing can be quite high. My only concern here is using the Medicare Improvement Fund. It's not like we've improved Medicare to the point that it doesn't need further improvement. So is this not harming that endeavor as well, or is it properly protecting our ability to continuously improve the Medicare program? Yeah, Mr. Smith.
I will tell you that the structure of this and the components of it being basically fact-based, evidence-based, I just think that it's a model for other parts of the government as well. And to use that as an offset, vetting that process through the process, I think is important as well. But folks who have had an interest seem to be okay with it. So I think it sets up a good scenario here.
Well, thank you. And the recurring theme that you're hearing from me today is a fundamental distrust of the federal agencies. There's no one home over at the Department of Health and Human Services. There hasn't been for 3 years. So transparency is great as long as someone's looking at it. So all of us, Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce, we have to do our oversight on this and make certain those dollars are going where they were intended. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter.
I just want to thank the gentlemen for their testimony and support of this legislation. I yield back.
Mr. Reschnithaler.
And for the second time today, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to associate my remarks with Mr. Perlmutter's, and I yield back.
Mr. Raskin, I see him here. Ms. Fishbach. Scanlon. Mr. Morelli.
I have no questions other than also to acknowledge that I join in support of Mr. Perlmutter's statements. It'll be one of the last times that ever happens.
Mr. Raskin, did you have any questions? Okay. Mr. Desaunier, Ms. Ross.
Mr. Chairman, just that this is a fitting tribute to the life and legacy of Congresswoman Walorski, and I'm honored to be able to.
Okay. Does anybody else? Yeah, Mr. Smith.
Just to touch on Mr. Burgess's concerns there, the state match component of this is somewhat unique, and I think very productive and relevant and appropriate, that can help bring more attention to the issues as a whole, and not just, you know, a one-way dollar expenditure from the federal government to the local, but the involvement of local and state is key. And I visited programs working on this issue myself, and it's quite impressive at how effective it is, and can be instructive, like I said earlier, for other programs as well.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, may I?
Yeah,
I just wanted to acknowledge Mr. Smith's remarks, and I think that is exactly on point. And when I visit with my local United Ways colleagues at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, they also speak that this program is one that is used very, very effectively. So thank you for that further clarification. I appreciate it.
And if I might add, Mr. Chairman,
yes,
the funds that we're talking about are unspent, and so we're not generating or taking anything else than what has already been approved for the purpose. And so given that, then I think, again, that consideration is worthy of thinking, but it doesn't really cause a problem. Thank
76. So, all right. So at some point, we have noticed earlier that this railway resolution may be coming before us, and we're trying to figure out who's coming to testify on both sides. But once we get them, we might go to them. But in the meantime, we will.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I mean, the press conference today at the White House, I learned that we are going to have this bill on the floor at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So I got to believe that
the rule will be on the floor at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. So
well, they said the bill will be on the floor.
Well,
so
I could tell you that would be the rule. It will be on the floor.
well,
at
I
9 a.m.
appreciate
in the
that
morning.
clarification.
Yeah. So
Mr. Chairman?
yes.
Not to be a fly in the ointment, but is there going to be an opportunity to amend it?
Well, we will. Yeah. I mean, we'll have to, I have to see what I haven't.
Clock is ticking on a number of subjects.
So the safe banking bill might find its way into the.
Just fair warning.
All right. So okay. So at this point, we will now move into our Members' Day hearing, and.
You're going to keep us here.
Well, until for a little bit anyway. But look at today's meeting gives all of our colleagues a chance to share ideas that may be useful as we look ahead to the 118th Congress. You know, as we've said over and over, no party has a monopoly on good ideas. When Democrats came into power during the 116th Congress, we understood that everyone has valuable insight to offer. That's how we created probably one of the most bipartisan rules packages in recent memory, by speaking with every member, from the longest serving to the newly elected, and spent months vetting ideas. Collaboration and a willingness to work together are imperative to ensure that we have a well-functioning House, one that doesn't work for one political party or the other, but for the American people. After all, that's what this is all about. A House governed by good rules not only is a sign of our democracy's health, but allows us to tackle the issues that can make a positive difference in people's lives. That's why we all ran for Congress in the first place. So this hearing will facilitate meaningful conversations, and I hope will inform the incoming Republican majority as they prepare the next rules package. We should all want to strive for rules that further improve transparency and accountability, measures that will bring this institution into the 21st century, and reforms that will advance the efficiency and efficacy of Congress. So I look forward to what should be a productive discussion, to hearing what our colleagues have prepared. And now let me turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments he wants to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is one of great importance as we provide.
We just have order.
I think Mr. Perlmutter is, kind of.
We want to.
Indeed, you are. Today's hearing is one of great importance as we provide a forum to hear ideas and proposals from members in the preparation of the rules package to govern the House during the upcoming 118th Congress. I want to thank our witnesses today, not only for taking the time to appear before this committee, but also for their thoughtfulness and hard work in assembling these proposals. Indeed, we are a better committee and a better institution for your participation today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to today's discussion. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And so I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on Members' Day, on our Members' Day hearing on proposed rules changes for the 118th Congress. And Representative Griffith, you are up first. And just make sure your mic is on, that's all.
All right, there we go. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Let me start, because I am going to mention him later, in just saying that it was my privilege and honor to call Don McEachin a friend. We rarely agreed on policy, but as several have mentioned here today, he was always had a smile. He was a very good lawyer, and I've got a story to go with one of my amendments that involves Don, and as I was contemplating it after learning the news last night, I thought about taking it out, and then I thought, no. It's a good story that talks about his legislative skill. I left it in my comments. But before we started, I wanted to let everybody know that while we didn't agree, he was a good friend.
Thank you.
And we served in the Virginia House before we served in this House together. And so we were longtime colleagues. All right. That said, I don't know what numbers you all have, but the first one I have is my legislative text change, which reinstates the Holman Rule. And I have a handout, an article by Mark Strand from the last time the Holman Rule came into effect, and I'll give that to our stenographer, and y'all can do with it what you will. But it's an article that talks favorably about the benefits of the Holman Rule. It's really not as big a deal as some have made it out to be. I wish I could say, since I revived it some years ago, that it was as big as the Washington Post thought it was in changing the way we do business. But it is one of many steps we can take that empowers individual members in trying to affect spending, and it allows you to retrench spending in an agency, which would include rearranging the deck chairs, so to speak. And you can eliminate a deck chair or two, if you wish. The rule, it's existed for roughly 100 years, on and off in Congress. The rule is rarely effective in getting passed on the floor. But in those occasions when it has been, it has made a substantial change and exercised the will of the people through the People's House. I think it's a tool that we ought to have as members. And look, all of the amendments that I'm going to propose today are attempts to try to make this place work better and to empower individual members. The Holman Rule is just one small part of that. I would like to see a number of these adopted.
Mr. Griffith, can you just recap the Holman Rule, please?
Sure. So what the Holman Rule does is it goes into Rule 21, and it allows you to cut spending and reorganize an agency inside of an appropriations bill. It has to be a general appropriations bill. It can't be any other bill. That's one of the criteria. You have to, it comes up on the floor and you have to get a majority, which is why it's hard to get any of the amendments passed. In fact, we used it for 2 years previously, and I don't believe, in fact, I know that none of the amendments were successful. I had one of my own, got some interesting information out of it, had a good debate. It allowed the members to figure out what was going on in a particular issue, but nothing actually passed. And that is the history of the Holman Rule over its 100 years, is that I would dare say maybe a dozen things have passed during that time period. But it's a safety valve that allows members to say, wait a minute, this agency isn't working right, and we think there's a better way to do it with retrenchment. You can't increase spending, you have to cut spending overall. But you can rearrange things. One that comes to mind, and I'm not planning on putting this in, but just comes to mind, is CDC's never been actually authorized, and while Energy and Commerce probably ought to figure out how to authorize the CDC, if we felt like there needed to be major changes, and even the CDC director says there need to be some changes, and if that needed to be done with a retrenchment, then you could possibly use that as a way to do that, or just to have a good discussion on the floor in a legislative body. So that's what it does. All right. So that pretty much explains the Holman Rule. Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you want me to stop and answer questions or go. I could go through the whole package and then open it up for questions.
Why don't you go through the questions, and Mr. Burchett is here too, and you can follow Mr. Griffith, and we could go to questions. What did I say? Okay.
You gave it a fancier.
The French pronunciation. Yeah.
So you want me to stop, answer questions?
Yeah, why don't you go through your...
Let him go. That's
fine. Why don't you come on up?
Because I got about 7 or 8.
Yeah, we have a little panel. Why don't you keep going, yeah. Keep going through yours.
Oh, you want me to keep going? Okay.
We'll
Yeah, have a seat.
You're here. All right.
All right.
Good.
The next one that I have is a change in the germaneness rule. That's in Rule 16. This would allow the speaker to have a more strict germaneness rule. So it restates in the germaneness rule. We got the germaneness rule. It then goes in and gives the speaker guidelines on what the speaker is to look at when determining if something is germane. The purpose of that, quite frankly, is to allow the speaker to set new precedent and create a more strict germaneness rule. Over the course of probably 100 years, and I haven't studied it carefully, but it looks like that's about right, we've gotten laxer and laxer, and the precedents have made it so that really our germaneness rule is pretty weak. This says if you're going to bring an amendment in, it's got to be germane to the original purpose of the bill. That's why you look at the title. The guidelines say look at the title, look at the code sections that are affected in the bill, look at the agencies that are affected in the bill. If you go outside of that, and if the original purpose is the doc fix in Medicare, you can deal with the doc fix in Medicare, but you can't come in and suddenly say we're going to take this bill that touches Medicare in one spot and turn it into an overall reform of Medicare. And you also, which we had happen, I know that was a rules issue, but we had it where the doc fix, and y'all might remember this, and the payment in lieu of taxes were added together in a single bill or in a single vote. Clearly not germane, and clearly shows how far afield we've gotten from the idea that and what the people expect us to do. They expect us to vote on one concept, one idea, what the bill did. It doesn't mean you can't have complex bills, but it has to be a part of the original concept and not something that suddenly got added on in committee, in rules, or on the floor. And the speaker would have the ability, and I gave the speaker, and I'll get to that later, I gave the speaker the ability to make that decision solely because I think we need to have a new understanding of germaneness, and an incoming speaker is the best chance to do that. And in order to do that, you have to change the rule just a little bit, so you got a new rule to work with, and you give them a new chance to set new precedent. And that's the purpose of that one. All right, moving on to the next, which I have as number 3. It's titled Bill Limitations. I will tell you it started off as 2 different amendments, and they are clearly severable. They're 2 different concepts, but they line up in the rules at the same spot. So I have in Rule 12, 2A, and then a separate and severable issue 2B. Let me talk about 2A first. 2A is that no bill shall be introduced which contains more than one purpose or question or questions of a bill that violates a single-purpose rule, the Speaker, on those questions, the Speaker also would have the ability to make that decision. Again, we sometimes get far afield. We don't, while we talk about single-purpose, and this is stuff the American people want and love. They like the idea of us voting on a single purpose. They like the idea of any amendments coming in being germane to the underlying bill. What this says, it just puts it in the rule. Again, a new speaker, and I would hope that a new speaker would interpret these strictly, because I think it makes our legislative process easier and better when you get to the floor, because you don't have to worry about all kinds of superfluous issues being suddenly raised on the floor with an amendment, which is one of the reasons why we've gone further and further away from open rules. I don't think we've had a true open rule in years, is because we're worried about, somebody putting in, whether it be on the left or on the right, putting in some kind of a crazy amendment. What this would allow us to do, in combination with the germaneness new rule, it would allow a speaker the ability to hone it in, make an announcement to everybody, hey, we're changing the tenor of this, and we're not going to allow those kinds of superfluous amendments to be brought to the floor. The second part, 2B, if I might go forward, is, and this one's a little dicier and not as loved by anybody, but it is a calendar deadline to introduce bills. Now, I put a proposal together because you got to start somewhere. I'm not saying that I've got this down pat. Some of these others I can defend to the death. This one's a little closer, but I do think that we need to figure out a schedule, because what happens is that we have bills that are introduced all the time. That leads to, and all of us have probably done it, I know I have, some issue comes up, it's the cause célèbre of the day, and your constituents want to know what you're going to do about it. Well, I'm putting a bill in today. And we get hundreds of those bills, and most of the time they don't come to the floor. But what happens is we have legislative staff, we have legislative services, or the people who help draft, the drafting people, they put in overtime to get all of this stuff drafted up and get it introduced. What this says is, if you've got an idea and you really like that idea, get it in. Now, I picked June 1st of each year. Get your bills in by June 1st. After that, and I went fairly relaxed on it, after that, in order to put a bill in, you would need consent of the House. You don't have to have unanimous consent. I came out of the Virginia legislature. I was a member of the Virginia House for many years. And in that context, we had to have unanimous consent if you passed the deadline. I'm not asking for unanimous consent, but you've got to come to the floor and say, hey, I got a really good idea. I think it ought to be a bill, and then the House has to vote on it. What that'll do is, it better be something you're really passionate about if you're going to come and do a mea culpa in front of the whole House. Now, I will tell you that I put it in as a calendar event. It may actually make more sense, and I'm happy to work with anybody who wants to work on this, to say that you want to do this based on a term, in which case I would propose January 30th of the second year of the term. It would not reduce as much the drive-by legislation or the legislation for cause célèbre of the day, but it would guarantee that in the second year you're dealing with the major issues and you're not dealing with a lot of distractions, because everybody's had plenty of time to put their bill in. So those are a couple of the bills. I got more. Hang tight. I have also a change in rule, and it's my numbered 4, Rule 29, and it's a limitation on waiver. Now, this goes hand in hand with germaneness and having the Speaker make a decision on that, and with the single-purpose rule. And it says that you shall not waive it without 2/3 vote of the whole House. Now, majoritarian House. House can waive it with 51. They can waive the rule that it has to be 2/3. The point of putting this into the rules is to make it clear that the germaneness rule and the single-purpose rule are special and should not be treated as just some other rule. That it is our intent that you ought to have a supermajority to waive those 2 rules. That you shouldn't just do it willy-nilly because on that particular day you felt like you wanted to get out by 2 o'clock instead of, working on something until 6 o'clock. I know people have a long way to go home, and I understand that. But the American people elected us to get a job done and not waive all the rules that may make things less comfortable, but I think this would help us in running this place more efficiently and more effectively over a long period of time. All of us are sloppy. We don't pay attention to it. We just throw stuff in. Oh, it's close, but we need to pay attention to that. Also going in line with some of these other rules, if you're going to have strict germaneness and you're going to have strict single purpose, which the American people, I think, want, and you make it clear you don't want it waived, if a speaker is consistently violating that, I think we need to have a vacate the chair motion. Now, I've put some guardrails on it because I think there are legitimate concerns with vacate the chair in the modern era. It worked for over 200 years. It worked very well. Only came up a few times. But today we're living in a world where there's 24-hour news. There's Twitter. I mean, we've all been in meetings where things are said, and before we can get out of the meeting, it's already all over Twitter and starts to get on Facebook and goes other places. A speaker cannot establish their administration and establish that they're doing a good job if there's an everyday motion to vacate the chair. I do think an individual member ought to have that right to bring the motion. It's not exactly, but it's kind of like our version of a no confidence vote. And so what I did was I said that any new speaker gets 7 months to get their administration established. At the end of the 7 months, a vacate the chair motion then becomes in order for any member to make. If a speaker faces a vacate the chair motion and succeeds in surviving the motion, a new motion cannot be made for 60 days. Some might argue for 90. I prefer 60, but you've got to, I think today, to have a true vacate the chair, which restores power to the individual members, you also have to have guardrails on it, because in the old days, what you did in D.C., probably the public back home didn't know about for at least a week or two, and sometimes months. Today, sometimes my constituents know what happened in a different committee before I do. And so that's why I thought that we need to look for some hybrid language that restores to the individual members. Each member should have a right to say, wait a minute, something's not working right here, and have a way to clean up things if necessary. I don't think it's going to be necessary very often. It wasn't for 200 years necessary very often. In fact, one of the times, the Speaker himself called for a vacate the chair motion to prove that he had the support on the floor, and he did. So that's my modified vacate the chair Rule 9. Timing of action reports. This one gets a little complicated. I'll do my best to explain it to you. You may have some questions on it. But this one is kind of interesting. What it just says is if a bill comes out of a committee, the Rules Committee has to send that to the floor within 10 days, or it comes up to the floor, 10 legislative days. It has to come to the floor in order to be acted on. If it comes out of a primary committee, that does two things in my opinion. One, make sure that if we pass a bill out of a committee, it actually gets a vote on the floor before that term of Congress goes poof. That doesn't always happen. A lot of times bills come out and they never get seen again. It also guarantees, I think, that the committee will do better work on the various bills, because we shouldn't be fixing bills on the way to the floor. And that brings up my Don McEachin story. I think it was the bill that dealt with surprise billing. Don raised a point in the committee. He said this doesn't work in Virginia because of the common law and statutory requirements in Virginia on the doctrine of necessities. I looked at it. My only complaint was he found it first. It was brilliant lawyering. He was absolutely right. We got we'll work on that on the way to the floor. I spoke to Don 6-8 months ago. I said, do you know if they ever got it fixed? Because I never got any word back that it had been fixed. He said, I don't know. I probably ought to check into that. The members have no way of knowing. We fix things on the way to the floor, and it's very efficient in the sense of getting things moved, but it's why sometimes you all get bills here in this committee that are not yet ready for prime time. If that bill is not yet ready for prime time, if two members raise an objection based on a good legal, this was not philosophical at all. The bill was a good bill overall. The fixing of this doctrine of necessities issue would have made the bill better. And in fact, in the Virginia legislature, chair would have looked, because you couldn't send a bill out till it was ready for prime time because it was going to show up on the floor 3 days later, the chair would have said, all right, Don and Morgan, the rest of us don't understand this. Y'all go out and figure out a fix. We'd have gone out in the hallway and come back with a fix in 15 minutes. It will make the committees work to get a bill that is in fact ready for prime time instead of saying, let's push it off to rules and let them fix it on the way to the floor. We should do our job in every committee. We should do good legislation. Don McEachin stood for that. He was a great lawyer. Again, I disagreed with him on a lot of issues. This one had no philosophy to it other than trying to get the law right. And Dr. Burgess mentioned that earlier, that was one of Don's hallmarks. Let's get the law right, even if I don't agree. I feel the same way. This rule would allow you to do that. Now, 10 legislative days enough? Do you need 14? But it shouldn't be unending. Then there comes up the issue where we send bills to multiple committees. So I created a safety valve for that. So if the primary committee reports it out, then once it is out of the primary committee, the remaining committees, and I got to figure out what I picked out here. I think I gave them 7 legislative days. All of the other committees have to make a decision on what they're going to do within 7 legislative days. Now, as committees are wont to do, they may come out with different versions of the bills. The Rules Committee, after hearing from the chairperson of that committee, of each of the committees involved in the various versions, or their designee, can then form the final bill, figure out what the differences are in the bills, and conform them to one bill that then gets sent to the floor. I allow additional time so that rules can work on that and get that done before the bill has to be reported to the floor, but it still has to be reported to the floor. Or, in the alternative, the Rules Committee can say, these things are so different and they're not ready for prime time, they can re-refer it or refer it back to the committees of jurisdiction to straighten it out and explain this doesn't work, or we don't understand what Committee A is trying to do here, Committee B and A get together, y'all figured out, we're sending it back. Have every right to do that. As does the floor in the case if a bill gets to the floor that's not right. We can always send it back to rework it. So that's the purpose of the timing on the timing action on all bills. But that way, if a bill gets out of committee, people know there's going to be action. It's not going to go into some black hole that nobody ever sees again. And oftentimes, it's not philosophical. It's that leadership, because they feel like they have to look at everything and time everything, they oftentimes don't have time to get to all of it. And so some good bills get left on the sidelines that the committee has already approved. Now, sometimes the leadership is trying to get a good press conference going and they want to pick a special day. You know, if we got a bill that deals with, you know, people falling in love, then they want to time it for Valentine's Day. Well, this just says, get your bills out. Let's do good legislative work. Let's not worry about the press conference. Press conferences are important. It's a part of our business. But legislating is a more important part of our business. All right, last but not least, I might be the only person in the entire house who loves this one. Proportional seating on committees. It's language that was taken out of the Virginia rules. Virginia adopted this rule in 1998. It is a tough rule. It's a tough love situation. And what it says you got to do is that if the House is divided, because we're a democratic republic, or a republic based on democratic principles, if the House is divided 60-40, the committees ought to be 60-40. If the House is 51-49, committees ought to be 51-49. There's a formula to take care of half people, because you can't obviously have a half a person on a committee. So all of the fractional seats are rounded towards the majority. Whoever has the majority gets that extra seat. It doesn't apply to rules and it doesn't apply to ethics. But you got to have, I think, to get good legislation. Now, you know, people don't like it because you can't get things done. But let me just give you a classic example of why this isn't right. And I'm not trying to pick on either side. It's just the one that I happen to know right now. When we came in 2 years ago, the Democrat majority was 51%, so it was 51-49. But the Energy and Commerce Committee, on which I serve, had a larger majority numerically than for the Democrats than the Democrats had on the floor. Now, I'm not saying Republicans haven't done similar things. I'm not trying to pick on either side. I'm just trying to get a system that works for everybody and does what our founders and what the prior people wanted us to do, which is to respect that we are a republic, but that we're based on democratic principles. What's better than that than saying the committee that's working on legislation and sending it to the floor is divided exactly the way the voters, or as close as you can get it to a whole person, the way the voters intended it to be done when they sent us here. It's hard. But when we started this, and of course it changes as people retire or unfortunately pass away, as we've had mentioned both today of Don McEachin and Jackie Walorski. Those numbers shift. So you go with the beginning of the term, and you figure out those proportions, and unless they shift dramatically, you leave them alone during the term. I would say you leave them alone even if it shifts dramatically, but usually it's not going to be much. We started it at 51-49. The Energy and Commerce Committee was 55-45. It's just not what the people back home expect us to do. If you asked them, what does common sense tell you to do? They would say, if they knew about it, and they don't. I'll borrow my friend here's line. He always says he's the 435th most important man in Congress. Powerful man in Congress. You ought to pay attention. I'm feeling that way on this amendment. I'm the 435th most influential on this issue. Probably not going to happen. But if you ask people back home if they knew about it, and if they said, do you think the committees ought to be divided up the way the voters sent us here, for good, bad, or other, they would say yes. Yes, they would. Independents are also covered, and they get counted in the majority number. If you have independents. I don't think we have any this time, but we will ultimately. I'm sure in the future have a few independents. And so that's taken care of in here as well. That being said, that's a brief summary, as you can probably tell, and I didn't use my notes much because I'm passionate about all of this stuff. I want this place, and it's not exclusive. There are lots of other amendments that you all are going to hear today that I would support. But I think that that Washington doesn't function well. It's not a product of Republicans. It's not a product of Democrats. It is a product of years and years of piling on of precedent and nobody examining things and saying, how can we do it better? These are just a handful of ideas. Like I said, I know a lot of others that are going to be put in today that are good ideas as well. But these are a handful of ideas that I personally feel ought to be given careful examination and adopted. I don't speak for any group on these, although some groups may like parts of it. As I said, I've put stuff in there that irritates everybody in one way or another, but I'm trying to get Congress to operate better, and I hope that this in some small measure has helped. I yield back.
Thank you very much. So let me just give everybody the plan here, because we have this rail bill coming up. So we're going to, Mr. Burchett, we're going to go to you next, and then we're going to do questions, and then we're going to go to the rail panel, and then hopefully that'll be quick. But for those who, if you want, you can go in the office, if you need to make, yeah, but for the people in the audience, if you want to go in the side office there to make calls, or we'll do whatever you have to do, feel free to do that. So, right, so we will go to you next. Okay. All right. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for allowing me to be here. The historical significance, I know this isn't significant for y'all, but it is for me. I wish my parents were alive to see this day, that I'm actually testifying before Congress. And, not in handcuffs or anything. Pretty good option right here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Not even suspect. Not even suspect.
I don't know about that.
Mr. Chairman, you may have heard we have this thing called the Commitment to America. We promise the American people a government that's accountable to them. Can you put your mic on, please? Sorry, you want me to start over with my jokes, or did you get them on? Did you get them on? We good? All right. I have some ideas on how to make that promise a reality, Mr. Chairman. Right now, the American people don't trust us about it. They can only trust us about as far as we can throw the dome off the Capitol. And under this Democrat-controlled government, Americans, I feel like, have been lied to. They've been misled and left entirely in the dark on the legislation that made their lives worse. We need to earn back their trust, and it starts with real transparency and accountability on our part. My rule proposals are based on a simple concept. America should always have access, easy access, to information about what's happening in Congress. My first proposed rule requires us to use bills at titles to describe what our bills do. In the Tennessee State Legislature, which was under Democrat control when these rules were enacted and they stayed in when the Republicans took over, the state legislature already had this rule in place. And if a bill is called the Dog Catcher Act, then dadgummit, the bill needs to be about dog catchers, not about pay raises, not about anything else. And we've made a habit out of passing multi-trillion-dollar spending bills, and I feel like they've been packed with woke wish lists. No one had any idea what was in them until after they were passed. And take the so-called Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It cost taxpayers $1.2 trillion, but only about 11% from our figuring of the spending went to roads and bridges. We don't need to sneak secret pay raises or woke climate equity programs into bills behind our constituents' back. That's some Democrat nonsense, and it has no place here in Congress, Mr. Chairman. I have another proposed rule, and if the Republicans do it, I'll be back up here next year saying it's Republican nonsense. I have another proposed rule which would require the clerk of the House to read the bill's Congressional Budget Office score immediately after the title. In Tennessee, we call that a fiscal note. In Tennessee, we have the best-run state in the nation. We have zero debt, Mr. Chairman. Taxpayers should hear how much a bill will cost before it's passed in Congress. It's their money, and they should know what's in it. I'm also proposing rules that would prevent the House from passing bills using methods that are easier to hide behind. No more en blanc votes. No, and I don't know how you even pronounce it, en blanc, but en blanc, I'm not sure exactly the pronunciation, en blanc. No more passing separate legislation in a procedural vote. No more amendments in nature of a substitute that substantially change the bill's original purpose. I'm also proposing a rule to prevent us from bringing a bill straight from introduction to the floor without going through the committee. Bills should not be written by a few leaders behind closed doors. They should be discussed and amended before being brought to a vote. If Americans can easily find out what bills we're passing and how much they're costing them and who's voting for them, then dadgummit, they're going to pay a lot more attention, Mr. Chairman, and I think that's a good thing. More Americans are in tune with what's going on here in the People's House, then we're doing something right. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record my letter to Republican leader Kevin McCarthy that outlines my rules proposals. I'm hopeful we can start to rebuild some trust with the American people, and these rules are a good place to start. Mr. Chairman, I want to close with one thing. The Democrat Speaker of the House was a man named Jimmy Nafee, and he's still a dear friend of mine. And he was very strict. He was very fair, but he had a rule. He said, if you didn't want to work, you shouldn't have hired on. Mr. Chairman, we need to start working because we've hired on. And I think these rules are a good move in that direction. So thank y'all for allowing me to be here.
Thank you very much. Let me just say, Mr. Griffith, I appreciated your Holman Rule explanation. You mentioned something to do with organizing the CDC. I just have to say that in my experience, the Holman Rule has been used to attack staff. That's how my friends have used it in the past. But I have a question about your committee ratio proposals. If you believe in a fair ratio reflecting the House, why would you exempt the Rules Committee, one of the most powerful committees in the House? I understand the Ethics Committee, but on the Rules Committee, under your proposal, I mean, if we were not exempted, we'd be 7-6 up here. I could live with that. Why is the Rules Committee exempted under your? Because it seems to me that's where.
Typically, in most legislative bodies, the Rules Committee is a little bit different makeup than the rest.
But the Rules Committee of the legislative bodies is not like the Rules Committee in the House of Representatives.
I know, but if you adopt all my rules, it'll be more like most of the other legislative bodies because I'm taking away your ability to do anything with bills that come directly from a committee of the primary committee without a substitute or a different bill coming from a different committee. So I am actually taking power away from the Rules Committee by sending things straight.
But you specifically made an exemption for the Rules Committee. So
I did because of the history in legislative in most legislatures, the Rules Committee is in fact generally more leaning towards the majority so that they can work their will. I recognize. Look, somebody wanted to make a change. I'm not saying I'd be against it, but what I'm saying is I'm recognizing the facts that usually the majority wants to be able to control what happens. But if you adopted the entire package, on any bill that came out of the primary committee, the Rules Committee would have to just forward that on. They're just a conduit. They are not taking action. They don't do amendments. on a bill that comes from the primary committee unless you've got multiple differing versions coming from differing committees.
But it sounds
So
like
then you
every
have your
bill would be,
primary-
it sounds like the way you're describing it, every bill would be a closed rule.
No, everything would go to the floor. In my world, it would go to the floor under the rules of the House. No need for a rule at all. Rules just sends it forward.
So just an open rule for everything?
For everything that comes out of a primary committee, without a competing bill from another committee in the same area. In other words, if House Resolution 1234 was sent to, or House Bill 1234 was sent to 6 committees, then rules would have a role to play. If it's sent to one committee, it goes straight to the floor. Rules Committee can just figure out, okay, we got 10 legislative days to get it on the floor. Makes sense that we do this on Thursday. That would be the Rules Committee's job. Send it forward to the floor. That's it. It would be a conduit. It's basically the patrolman directing traffic in a case where the bill comes straight out of committee.
Well, look, I appreciate both of your testimony, and look, I mean, this is, the purpose of this hearing is to have everybody express their ideas on how we can improve the operation of this House, and so I again appreciate you being here, Mr. Cole.
Just quickly, I want to thank both our witnesses. I've got some reservations on the vacate the chair idea, and I would be less than honest to say that. And I would have liked your committee ratio thing a lot more 2 years ago than right now. So it has less appeal to me than it did in the past.
That's why it's fair.
We'll have that discussion, I'm sure, tomorrow at great length. But with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
This is Torres.
May I suggest a change to your proposal, that next time you actually bring paper so that we can follow along?
Oh, I
Because
sent it in
we
advance.
have them, but they're not in, I mean, we don't ask you to come here at a specific time, so our notes are not in the specific order that, you are presenting. You have some interesting comments, and I would have liked to follow along with you. But thank you for being here.
I will leave, because I have not only specific proposals, but I actually drafted the rules as I believe they should appear and in the location that they should appear inside the rules package.
Thank you.
I'll leave a copy here.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Griffith, I'm compelled to ask you if the Holman rule, as currently applied, has it worked? Has it actually rescinded spending in a particular area? I appreciate that it's been around since 1876.
There have been, I would say, a half dozen, maybe a dozen, somewhere between a half dozen and a dozen times when it has worked. One of those actually went to the Supreme Court, I want to say about 1940, give or take a couple of years, and the Supreme Court upheld that this was proper within, proper process within the House.
Well, I also think it's an important tool that would return power to the people who are supposed to represent their districts. And it's been a shame that we haven't had it available. I recognize that it's sometimes difficult to, it's unwieldy, but at the same time, that's probably for a purpose as well. I do have to say, and I completely agree with Tom, with ranking member on the ratios on the committee. I mean, it was offensive to me, and you remember this. We sat through those reconciliation bills in committee, dutifully listening and holding the votes, and we'd lose. The majority in the committee was 6 votes. The majority on the floor was 5 votes. And that was always particularly disturbing to me. Not that we would have won any more votes, but how could there be a greater proportion on the committee than there was on the floor of the House? And I do think that is something that really should be given some consideration. As far as the number of people on the Rules Committee, Mr. Chairman, if I remember correctly, Sam Rayburn, when he was Speaker, actually enlarged the Rules Committee. He wanted to replace some Democrats on the Rules Committee, but his conference wouldn't permit that. So he expanded the Rules Committee in order to overcome the no votes of his recalcitrant Democrat members who are going to stand in the way of JFK's rather progressive agenda that he was going to institute after the 1960 election. and it was a very close vote on the floor to change the ratio. So I guess we could have that discussion, but as we kind of sit here on the dawn of the next Congress, I rather like the 9-4 ratio. It has a certain appeal to it. Just an observation for you. But I do think we really ought to pay attention to the ratios on committee. You're right. If the people at home knew what was actually taking place, they would be concerned that there could be such an imbalance of power. When the people spoke and elected representatives in a certain proportion, the committees actually should reflect that.
And while we haven't been perfect and we've never had a rule, I will say that it has, over the last decade or so, it has gotten worse historically. Over decades and centuries, Congress has been pretty close on the committees, maybe off by one person. It's only within the last decade or so that we've started to get away from that, which is why I feel that it's important that we start to put it in the rules and codify that that's what we're shooting for.
Well, I thank both of you for your participation today. It's going to be a long day, so, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks. Mr. Griffith, appreciate your different comments on these rules. Colorado follows a lot of the same things that Virginia does. But we do operate very differently here. Whether we're supposed to be like a state legislature or not, that's sort of the $64 question. Germaneness, though, really is a roadblock. We've got a bill coming up today when you all finish on railroads and strikes. I want to add, and I've got some co-sponsors of my bill, safe banking, or I want to add some compensation improvements for us as members of Congress to that bill, and I know I'm going to run headlong into germaneness. So it does ultimately come down. Now, you talked a lot about single subject. In Colorado, we have a single subject rule, and you have a tight title or an open title, and you can add things like crazy. Having been in front of the parliamentarian on a number of things that I've wanted to get into bills, I know that there is a germaneness element to this. So I appreciate a lot of the things that you talked about, and I do think it would make us in the Congress look more like a lot of the state legislatures if that's what we want to do. And I think your point is, well, that's what people expect. So that'll be the conversation that we have. I appreciate that you want to bring all these things up as we head into a Republican House. It'll tie your hands a little bit, and, I appreciate that. And we've talked a lot about a number of these points in the Modernization Committee of Congress so that we empower individual members and not so much leadership. And I think that's one thing you're trying to do. So I appreciate your comments. I don't think you're right on the germaneness, but I do understand a lot of what you're suggesting, and I yield back.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just thank both of the witnesses for coming in. I know there's a lot of other members who would like to speak, so for brevity, I'm going to yield back.
Okay, Mr. Raskin.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Scanlon, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate both gentlemen and their thoughtfulness about how to proceed. I just wanted to make one observation. I think a part that I think generally disagree with relative to passage of bills out of committee. And I did serve, like many of you, in the state legislature in New York for a long time. And they're different bodies. I mean, Congress is much, much different. And the breadth of sort of diversity in the Congress and geographically and in all kinds of ways, I think just makes it a different place. But the idea that a committee discharges a bill and it immediately goes to the floor within a period of days, it seems to me too simplistic. There may be many reasons that you report a bill out of committee. You may want to encourage debate with the Senate and figure by moving a bill you can get a real conversation going. You may not want the bill to go to the floor for consideration as the committee chair, as the members. There may be a whole host of reasons to do that. And frankly, I think it eliminates some of the judgment, which I hope we collectively make, the 435 members. And to turn this into sort of a series of if this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this must happen, and this must, I think it removes so much judgment from us and frankly creates an enormous, I think, bottleneck that the Rules Committee is intended to help address. I just think that's my general observation of it, that there needs to be room for judgment here by members of the majority, whoever that majority is. The leadership ought to play a role. The Rules Committee ought to play a role. I think this is the oldest committee in the House, and it was intended to be sort of the traffic cop to help make judgments about what bills go to the floor. Now, you know, we're going to change in a few weeks, and maybe the new majority will think that these are the ways to proceed, but I suspect they're going to want the leadership and the Rules Committee and the Rules Committee Chair and others going to want to have an ability to weigh in and measure whether every single bill that gets out of committee is worthy of going to the floor just as it's reported out of committee. My guess is they won't think that's a great idea. We'll see. The other, and finally, I just say that you pointed to, I think you said it was around surprise billing, and one of the, I don't know what committee you're referring to, reported out. I know that was a bill that had jurisdiction in multiple committees. That must have been, was that Energy and Commerce?
It was.
It was. But what you said is that the committee leadership chose to ignore the point that had been raised or said it would get fixed, and whether or not it was fixed, I don't know. But I'm not sure that's an argument for doing this then, that because you might have the same dynamic where someone says, well, we'll get an amendment at some point that fixes it. Whether that ends up happening, I don't know. But the waiting period or the time to go through another committee to sort of consider the elements of it or the provisions of it would be lost. There would be no sort of barrier. There would be no way to slow it down under the example you used, which I thought was, frankly, an odd use of the example. It was an imperfect bill when it came out of committee. I wouldn't want that to go to the floor. I would want additional steps to look at whether or not there was a mechanism to make it more perfect or make it better.
And my point is that it shouldn't be lost forever, and that the committee ought to have the discipline to make sure they answer all the questions, because they're supposed to be the experts in that particular area, to answer all the questions necessary to get that bill ready for prime time.
Yeah.
But if it gets out of here, it's going to be on the floor, and it could become the law of the United States. Let's make sure we have it right, particularly when you have, it's not a political, there was no political mischief, and that's the reason I used that example. You had a Republican, conservative Republican, and a liberal Democrat who generally don't agree, but both recognize that in their states, where both of them were licensed to practice law at one time in their lives, recognized that this bill had a glitch in it, and it should have been fixed before it left our committee. And I don't think the chairman was saying, you know, oh, well, we don't care about it. I think what he was saying was, oh, the process here is that we'll get staff to look at it and we'll fix it somewhere along the way.
But isn't that respectfully, isn't that a better approach than, when I served as majority leader in the State Assembly in New York, and bills would get reported out of committee. They'd come to our Rules Committee, or then they'd have to come to me to determine whether or not we'd put the bill on the floor. And I'd say to my legislative counsel, when it came to us, we were playing with live ammunition now because the bill could actually pass out of the House. I'm not sure every committee chair took that responsibility to heart. I'm not sure, given human nature, I think people like the idea this has to go through multiple levels of review, and so you can catch a provision or a problem with a bill that is about to go out of committee, legitimately has support to get out of the committee, but there are some technical issues. Let's make sure that the Rules Committee or the Ways and Means Committee or wherever it needs to go is aware of those changes so we can make them. I think the multiple reviews are actually one of the things that makes it a better process. So anyway, I just make that observation.
And
I don't want to belabor the
when I was
point.
majority leader in the Virginia legislature, I would catch those things, and the floor would send them back. They came straight to the floor. I would look at the calendar for the day. I'd read the bills. If I caught something, we shipped that thing back to committee and said, y'all don't have this ready yet. Get it ready for prime time. It makes your chairman and your committee more accountable for the stuff they're putting out and sending to the floor.
Well, and I don't disagree that they should do that. I mean, I think every time you put out a bill, you should, particularly if you're committee chair and you're reporting the bill affirmatively, you should do so with the expectation this could get on the floor and could become law. So let's make sure it's as good as it can be. But I don't think the multiple levels of review, and frankly, it would be harder to find those changes to be made if there were suddenly dozens of bills coming all at once to the floor and each of them had the okay of the committee chair, but there wasn't a process in between to start looking at them and make sure that they were in the proper form. So anyway, didn't want to belabor it, but I did want to just share my concerns about doing it that way.
Mr. DeSagne.
I have nothing to add.
Ms.
Go
Ross.
back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just food for thought, and I have nothing to add. I yield back.
Thank you. Any other questions for this panel? If not, thank you for being here. You are free to go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just the lack of comment on my thoughtful legislation mean total endorsement? Is that what I understand?
It's-
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not going to write this. At this time, we will recess our Members' Day hearing briefly, and the Rules Committee will now consider a resolution to provide for with respect to the unresolved disputes between certain railroads represented by the National Carriers Conference Committee of the National Railway Labor Conference and certain of their employees. This legislation adopts the tentative agreement that unions and railroads negotiated in September to avoid a rail shutdown. I'm proud that our pro-union and pro-worker president and labor secretary, Joe Biden and Marty Walsh, fought hard to get a fair deal for railroad employees. This historic agreement secures significant advances for workers, including a 24% raise, no changes in co-pays, deductibles, or co-insurance costs, and increased safety protections. I want to be clear, this agreement is not perfect, and Democrats are going to continue fighting like hell, just as we've been doing, for all of our workers to have good wages, safe jobs, and paid sick leave. But we also need to listen to our labor leaders. This agreement was approved by labor and management negotiators in September. Since then, the majority of the unions in the industry have voted to approve the deal. So while I and others are reluctant to override standard ratification procedures, President Biden has called on Congress to act without delay to avoid a catastrophic shutdown, and that is what the purpose of this gathering is about right now. And with that, I'm going to yield to our ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here on exceptionally short notice on an emergency measure intended to address labor issues at the nation's railroads. As every person in this room knows, railroads represent the lifeblood of American commerce. Almost every item in this room has, at one point or another, been carried on a train. Ensuring that the nation's railroads remain open and operating to carry goods to all points of the compass is critical and indeed vital, not only to the economy, but to our national security. Unfortunately, we are here today because of yet another blunder by the Biden administration. As we've repeatedly seen, whether on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, on the promise to forgive student loans, on gas prices, and now on labor negotiations, the Biden administration has a bad habit of making pie-in-the-sky promises that they cannot keep. At this late hour, it's clear that there's little we can do other than to support the measure. The clock is running out, and the President has made clear that this resolution is necessary to avoid a costly strike at the nation's railroads right as we go into the holiday season. With the economy ready to slide deeper into recession, we cannot risk that outcome. Congress, in my view, must act. However, it must also be said that it's astonishing that we are being asked to clean up President Biden's mess. The President ran on a platform of being a stable, trusted hand at the tiller. But instead of being a stabilizing force, the President's policies are only leading to more uncertainty. This is a sorry state of affairs, and it's deeply concerning that Congress is being asked to take extraordinary action to pull this hot potato out of the fire before the American economy crashes. I would hope the President takes a lesson from this episode, one that ensures he will be more focused in the future on the best interests of the American people. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to welcome our witnesses to testify on a resolution to address the unresolved disputes between certain railroads. Representative Payne and Representative Davis, we are delighted that you are here. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne. You may proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole. I thank you for holding this timely hearing and for having me here before you today. As the chairman of the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials, it is my duty and responsibility to bring this legislation that will prevent a nationwide
freight rail shutdown to the floor of the House of Representatives. That duty is burdensome, nevertheless, as Congress has now been forced to step in as a result of the railroad industry's failure to negotiate paid sick leave for their nearly 115,000 dedicated, hardworking, and essential rail workers. These men and women kept our economy alive through the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of our nation's most challenging times. However, in making the decision to bring this legislation to the floor, I had to think about the hundreds of millions of American families who would suffer from soaring fuel prices to the cost of rising food prices if we did not bring forth this tentative agreement. Every American would suffer if this strike took place, bringing our economy to a screeching halt at a time we need to be focused on economic recovery. Economists gather that even a short-term strike would deliver a debilitating blow to our economy, and reporters have laid out what is clearly at stake if we fail to act. The potential rail strike could impact gas prices, according to AAA. Chemical industry warns that rail strike would shut plants and cost the economy billions on CNBC. And a rail strike looms, and the impact on the U.S. economy could be broad, Associated Press. Make no mistake, understand just as our railroad workers do that we are here today because for decades, the rail industry has undercut the very men and women who have delivered them record-breaking profits. Those strict attendance policies, steep workforce cuts, and the closures of yards and shops, railroad workers were forced to show up every day and night out of their commitment to our country. These frontline workers are true patriots. The fact is, industry leaders know the power they have and how deeply dependent our economy is on the rail industry and, more importantly, its workers. With nearly 1/3 of our nation's freight moved by rail, the failure to prevent a rail disruption would not only stunt our economic growth and interrupt supply chains around the world, but also skyrocket the cost of fuel and food just before winter, putting us dangerously close to the possibility of a recession. This would impact every American family, causing shortages of groceries, medications, and other necessities. In September, rail union leadership and the railroads reached an agreement on a new contract. This agreement grants workers a 24% raise and improves some health coverage, among other benefits. Nevertheless, these are people who haven't had a pay raise in 3 years. It is deplorable that the railroad industry was unable to cover paid sick leave for their workers. My decision to introduce this legislation that locks in the September agreements and provide certainty for the farmers, manufacturers, and families our nation also depends on was not easy, but it had to be done. I'd like to thank President Biden, Secretary Walsh, and House and Senate leadership for their tireless work forging this deal, and I am ready to answer any questions you may have. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Chair McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, the members of the committee, and also my good friend, Mr. Payne. Over the past 2 years, freight railroads and rail labor unions have been negotiating pay and benefit for railroad workers. This summer, the two sides were released from mediation by the National Mediation Board. The labor unions declined arbitration, which ultimately led President Biden to appoint a neutral presidential emergency board, or PEB, to review the matter and issue recommendations. After a detailed review, the PEB issued its recommendations in August of 2022. It supported railroad workers receiving historic raises in salary, retroactively starting in 2020 through 2024. It also supported workers receiving generous health care coverage and paid time off, among other benefits. The freight railroads embraced the recommendations of the PEB, as did the shippers, including those in the agriculture, energy, fertilizer, and chemical industries. Nonetheless, a few labor unions rejected the terms that their own elected leaders negotiated on their behalf, putting the country on the brink of a full-fledged railroad strike that would shut down our economy. In September, with the strike only hours away, the representatives for both parties agreed to a tentative agreement, or a TA, that adopted the PEB recommendations plus additional benefits for maintenance of way employees. The new agreement was again accepted by the freight railroads and shippers and sent to the union members for a vote. After weeks of consideration, 8 labor unions voted to ratify the tentative agreement and 4 voted to reject it. Rejecting unions demanded more paid time off and have now threatened to strike at midnight on December 9th if their demands aren't met. A freight rail strike would devastate the supply chain and shut down the country. Experts have estimated that a strike could cost the economy up to $2 billion per day. Add that to the fact that this is the busy holiday season when package volumes are higher than normal. President Biden has now indicated that he and his administration have failed to resolve the dispute. Given the clear failure of the administration to resolve this dispute, it now falls to Congress to stop a strike and ensure there is no repeat of last year's supply chain crisis in the middle of the holiday season. Today, we are considering the terms of the tentative agreement, which goes above the PEB's recommendation. The tentative agreement is more than fair for the railroad workers, supported by 8 of 12 of the labor unions that represent the rail industry, and the other 4, again, were accepted and negotiated by the leaders of those unions who were sent to negotiate on behalf of the workers. This bill is, again, supported by the freight rails and shippers. And I appreciate the rail workers. Look, as somebody who has had a great working relationship with all 12 of the rail unions that are part of this agreement, I can understand their concerns, which is why we're at this point where we're asking Congress now to step in to support the tentative agreement. But my problem is, why are we even asking Congress to step in? I associate myself with many of the comments that Ranking Member Cole made. This is an administration who said they were going to come in and change the way this country operated. There should be nobody in a better position than President Biden to get this done without us setting a terrible precedent to where we are going to solve this problem. And unfortunately, that precedent being set today could lead to many people in the future, not me, coming back here again to address future disagreements within the rail industry. This is something that should have been done without us, but I agree with Chairman McGovern. I agree with Ranking Member Cole. It's kind of past the point of no return. We have to support this agreement, but it doesn't mean I can't come here and complain about it to you, Mr. Chair.
That's what the Rules Committee is for.
I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me yield to Mr. Cole.
Just quickly, I'm glad my friend's here one more time. I didn't think I would have the chance to see you again, and I'm glad you're here with the same complaint I have. This was supposed to have been fixed, and I think the American people thought and had every reason to believe that it had been fixed in September, and it's just another thing of punting past the election. And I do not like intervening in this way. I know neither of you do, to be fair, and you both reflected that in your comments, and it's unfortunate we're having to do it because I don't like the precedent at all, but I also am very concerned about the consequences if that strike were to go forward. I know we all are. Put a lot of people out of work. None of us want to do that on either side of the aisle, but wow. To coin a phrase, what a way to run a railroad. That I'll yield back.
Torres.
Can I reserve my time?
Okay, Mr. Perlmutter.
Just a couple questions, gentlemen. Which unions have objected to the settlement?
There are 4 of the 12 unions involved. I think the staff has the list of, we'll get that for you. BRS, MBWE, the Smart TD, and IBB out of the 12.
Okay.
They represent 115,000 workers.
Those 4?
Yes.
Okay, and just in my area, SMART has got a big presence in Colorado. You may have heard me earlier. Time is short, obviously. Time is short on this particular matter. I'd like to add a few things to this bill. I'm not sure that they fall under the title of the bill, one being the Safe Banking Act, the other being some compensation improvements for us. But obviously this is very important. Clearly from the President's point of view, Republicans seem to be supportive of trying to avoid a shutdown of our railways. But, you know, for me, I've always tried to work with the unions in my area. And SMART, I think, is probably the biggest of the railroad unions that are involved in this conversation. What is it that those 4 are holding out for? Can you tell me?
Well, sir, there has been an issue around sick time. And there are situations that the unions and the membership feel that are just not fair. They have very serious schedules that they have to meet, and because the railroads actually have cut their workforce and have had record profits during this time, but it's because of the schedules that they give the workers. Sometimes, you know, it's basically a situation where they ask, you know, someone says that they're sick or they have to take their child to the doctor, so they need a day off, and, you know, the railroad industry almost asks, is like, well, can't the child go alone, you know? It's really just unfair, and it's unfortunate. That was the one sticking point in this whole matter. That was the whole issue. The increases in pay wasn't an issue. They weren't even fighting over that. It was about this one issue, paid sick time. And, you know, if you really look at what the railroads are asking these workers to do, none of us would believe it was fair. That's where they are, and they have decided. You know, I didn't vote, so I don't know, but I know that this was a major issue that continued to come back to me in discussions.
So Mr. Davis, gentlemen, Mr. Payne, have any of these unions that are not happy with the deal, have they reached out to either of you specifically? I mean, I heard tangentially from SMART in my area, but not, you know, I think they've been hoping to get a deal done somewhere along the line. But I guess my question to you two is, have any of the unions reached out to you, either side, those that favor the deal or those that don't favor the deal?
I've spoken to several, and have been, since this whole issue has come up, trying to reach out to them, and I'm still in the process of talking to them. So.
Mr. Davis.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. The answer is no, I haven't had conversations directly with the 4 the four unions that have had issues with this, that brought us to this point. But as somebody who's known in this institution as a pro-labor Republican, I've had great relationships with many of the 12. Let's just say some better than others. But in the end, it's not expected that the membership hasn't reached out to us. Remember, this was thrown on us by the administration. I mean, we're doing this in kind of an emergency situation to avoid a nationwide shutdown of our economy. And in the end, we have to take a look back at where we are, not where we came from, rather than just where we are. Yes, there's some issues that these four have with the sick leave. Those are issues that should have been negotiated before we got to mediation, before they got to the PEB, before we get to this TA agreement that we're being asked to push through Congress, and again, setting a terrible precedent on. It's a terrible precedent that should be addressed by modernization, and we shouldn't set precedents like this and get involved in labor disputes because it leads to issues in the future when Congresses don't look like the Congresses of today and don't operate like the Congresses of today. So we had 12 labor unions that their leaders negotiated through the mediation program, through the President Biden's neutral PEB. They negotiated a 24% salary increase. They negotiated paid time off. They negotiated other health care benefits that all the leaders of all 12 unions negotiated and supported. It's these four where the membership did not agree with their own elected leadership on these issues. Now, here we are today. President Biden has said, we want to save the economy by making sure we don't have a rail strike. I think we all agree that that's a good thing. How we're doing it, terrible precedent. Already said that numerous times. But President Biden, his own PEB, did not think the concerns regarding specific sick time were enough to get addressed in not just the PEB agreement, but also the TA that we're discussing today. So as somebody who's very cognizant and very understanding of some of the demands and the needs of our rail workers, let's also remember where we came from and where we are today, which is a pretty good deal that every single leader in all 12 unions negotiated and accepted, and that's what we're being asked to do.
All right, thank you, gentlemen.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess, Mr. Davis, just to continue on that thought, that's why so many of us are perplexed, number one, why we're here today, having this emergency meeting to do this emergency legislation, which, as you pointed out, is going to set a terrible precedent going forward. But where is the disconnect here? Why couldn't they accomplish what they set out to accomplish?
I mean, I can't answer that. I can only speculate. And my own speculation is maybe the Biden administration and the Secretary of Labor are not as able to solve this problem on their own. When they come to us to set a terrible precedent, it sets precedents for future administrations. And that, to me, is the biggest concern long-term. Look, my time in front of rules, I'm perplexed as to why I'm here again, too, Mr. Chair. But in the end, it's going to come to a close. But what many of you are going to deal with for many years to come are now instances where we're more likely not to have agreements, more likely to move beyond mediation, move beyond PEBs, TAs, and whatever other acronyms out there. And they're going to come to Congress.
Correct.
And then you got to remember, too, some of our colleagues may decide to want to start in Congress. And what is the worst thing that could happen, again, as a pro-labor Republican, is to have this institution negotiating labor agreements. I mean, no offense, but I don't think that's the place that our rail workers, our men and women in organized labor, would want their labor agreements negotiated. And this is exactly what we're being asked to do on the back end. But rest assured, this precedent being set by the Biden administration's failures will lead to many of our colleagues wanting to address things on the front end of labor agreements.
Sure. Why go through a negotiation? Why go through arbitration when you know the final common pathway is going to be to come through the Congress and try to get what you want legislatively? Let me just ask you about the timeline of things. I mean, if this bill passes somehow before the 9th and is signed into law, how long is it in effect? When is the next a choke point on this. I mean, this is not in perpetuity.
Yeah, this agreement, I believe, lasts through 2024. So, but again, if Congress sets the precedent to approve this agreement, Congress, I would think, could change the agreement again, even in that time of 2024. I doubt that would happen. I would hope that all of you who remain, would ensure that that doesn't happen. But, Perlmutter's not here to give me the complete confidence that that's the case. But in the end, I mean, 2024, I believe, is the deadline, and my team will clarify if that's not the case. But again, it goes back to precedent. I'm going to support this because, like all of us, we want to avoid the catastrophe that a rail strike would cause this country, especially at this time. But that doesn't negate the fact that this is a terrible precedent. It's a terrible place to address it.
Well, and I share your concern about the ability of the White House and the Secretary of Labor that have left us at this point. But honest Injun, if they're looking at the pace of how things work in the United States Congress, if it runs out in 2024, you probably better get to work on the next one, because it ain't going to be quick. And to associate myself with the ranking member's comments, I think the precise quote is, "What a peculiar way to run a rail line." So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Yeah. Before I yield to Mr. Torres, let me just say, Congress is not negotiating this deal. If we were, we would deal with the paid sick leave. I mean, that's where a majority in this House right now is. I don't know where they'll be next year under the new leadership, but we would deal with this. And look, the fact of the matter is that these rail workers, have routinely been screwed by corporate interests that haven't given a damn about their well-being or their lives, or whether they can go to a doctor's appointment and still be able to pay, their rent or their mortgage or their insurance bills. I mean, this is an awful place to find ourselves in right now. Let me just say, nobody has been more pro-labor than Marty Walsh, the Secretary of Labor, and to the fact that this agreement is as good as it is, and I don't think it's good as good as it should be, but the fact that it is where it is due in large part to his efforts and to that of President Biden. And as the chairman of the Rules Committee, who has to sit here and get amendments from everybody, as my colleagues up here do, I will tell you that, my friends on the other side of the aisle who are complaining right now are the ones who bring anti-labor union amendments up here all the time. And I'm not saying you, I'm just saying members of your party. And so the bottom line is, we are now faced with this kind of terrible situation where you have to choose between supporting an imperfect deal that has already been negotiated, or an economic catastrophe that is hard to even fathom what it would mean at this particular point. But I don't blame, I'm not here to cast aspersions on those rank and file members of those unions that didn't endorse the deal. I mean, people are tired of being mistreated. They're tired of being, their concerns being ignored. I mean, that is, So I appreciate the efforts of President Biden. I appreciate the efforts of Secretary Walsh. And by the way, when we talk about the oppression of workers in this country, it's not just, restricted to the rail industry. I can go right down the list of, where well-connected billionaires, corporations, routinely go out of their way to try to stick it to the workers. So we didn't negotiate this deal. The question is right now, what are our choices? And the choice we have to make is either you accept this deal, and I don't like the precedent, but it's where we are, or, you don't, and then the consequences, I think that we all have outlined here today, go into effect. So this is not a happy day by any means, but we need to proceed. Mrs. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. Rodney, since you brought it up, I'm going to also say that I have a 100% labor record, not just in Congress, not just in the state legislature, not just in my time as mayor or city councilwoman, but lifetime. Unfortunately, I can't say the same thing for labor because I don't have their 100% support. But, you know, when it comes to labor issues, I'm very passionate about that because I did work a job where I had to ask permission even to go to the bathroom, where sick days were given, but they were frowned upon. So I feel the pain of these workers that simply want to be able to be sick when they're sick, to take care of a loved one when their loved one is sick. I'm very disappointed, though, that none of the 12 labor organizations that are impacted by the decision that we are being asked to make today have had any contact with my office. I don't know about the chairman or anyone else, but we have had zero contact. It wasn't until this meeting started that I texted somebody, then all of a sudden an alarm went off somewhere in the Inland Empire in California. I guess what I'm going to ask right now is, what did we learn from, you know, that date of August 5th, 1987? August 5th, 1987, then President Ronald Reagan fired 11,000 flight attendants, 11,000. He also created a lifetime ban on rehiring any of those striking members. The union was eventually decertified. I don't believe that anyone working outside of those people that work in that job industry has the right to negotiate on behalf of those workers. And while I applaud the president and the labor secretary for doing everything in their power to try to bring all parties to the table, it is extremely disappointed that I'm being asked here today to vote on something and to impose something that I would consider as radical as firing 11,000 people. So with that, I'm going to yield back.
Mr. Reauthorization.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Davis, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Look, yes, I do, sir. Thanks for asking.
I could just tell by the way you were looking at me that you wanted to say more, so.
Well, that's not why I was looking at you, Guy. There were plenty of other reasons we'll talk about later. But in all seriousness, look, I get it, we're here. I got to give the administration credit for getting to a point where they're asking Congress to solve the problem. This is not without precedent that Congress has addressed rail issues, but it hasn't been done since 1992. And I would argue with all of my colleagues here that this Congress is a lot different than the one in 1992 in an ability to govern and get things done and do it in a way that's not as polarizing as what we see today. So yes, President Biden, Secretary Walsh, through the different steps that everybody, including myself, had laid out as to where we are today, yes. Did they go in and get a deal that they feel and their administration feels is completely acceptable because they're asking us to ratify it without any changes? So yes, they have gotten to the point where you have the 24% raise across the board for the lifetime of this deal, which is 2 years. They also have, you're talking about paid time off improvements, health benefit improvements. Now there is this discussion within the 4 disgruntled unions as part of rail labor that have asked for more. And Chairman, you're right, it's not being addressed today. That doesn't stop you guys in the majority from making a change, but that would disrupt what the Biden administration has negotiated already. So in the end, we have to ensure that this doesn't blow up our economy. And we understand that. But I would argue, and I would hope that my colleagues here who are going to be raising their right hand on January 3rd, I hope you all can sit down in a bipartisan way with all 12 of the unions and say, how do we avoid this in the future? Because in the end, I still believe in today's reactionary Congress, in today's social media heavy Congress, that you've got a chance that our colleagues will want to negotiate labor agreements on the front end rather than on the back end right now after the administration has said this is the deal they want. This is Joe Biden's deal. This is Marty Walsh's deal. This is the deal that they're throwing to us to make sure that we fix it before the holidays start, before our economy is blown up, and we go deeper into economic malaise.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Who do we have here? Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just wanted to thank both of the witnesses for their testimony. Thank you, Mr. Payne, for your excellent elucidation of the issues, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Morelli, Ms. Fishback, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm quiet, but I am still down.
No, I just, you know.
No, that's all right. I just have a couple of questions. As I was looking through the resolution, it said the most recent tentative agreements, side letters, and local carrier agreements. I guess, is that pretty typical that that's included in negotiating contracts when they're settled? I guess I'm just, and what would be, this is really technical because I'm just reading it. I'm just kind of curious more than anything, like what would be a side letter? What would that be?
Yeah, I can only speculate, Michelle, that maybe that's the change that the TA recommended for the maintenance of way workers that would be different than the other unions, but I'm not an expert in labor agreements, which is why I don't think Congress should be either.
Well, and maybe that's part of my point, because I guess, and I'm just curious, you know, you mentioned the precedent we're setting. So this is not, and since I'm new to Congress, I still get asked this, this has never been done, or what's the history of it?
1992.
Yeah.
Okay.
30 years ago, Congress was asked to intervene, and you know, it hasn't happened, obviously, very often, but you know, here we are. You know, Congress has intervened. It says 18 times in its history. But I want to clarify something, Mr. Chairman, that I made a statement earlier.
It's my time.
It's
my time.
I'm sorry. Okay. No, I apologize.
And I'll be done in a minute, but I guess I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Mr. Davis was talking about. The precedent is horrible, and the fact that we aren't experts, and that we are going to be voting on something that we can't, I mean, I don't even know the definition of a side letter or what it would be, and so but I understand the implications of shutting the rails down, and, you know, in the critical time of the year, and our supply chains, my farmers, you know, they've already had issues with supply chain issues, and so very concerned that we are intervening on this when we don't have any business in it.
Well, look, I've already said, like, I'm a pro-labor Republican. I've got great relationships with many of the rail unions that are part of this agreement. And I also as somebody who has 4 Class I railroads going through my district, many of my constituents are part of these unions. Many of my constituents work for the same companies that are going to be affected by this agreement. But you brought up agriculture. I mean, my products that are grown in central and southwestern Illinois don't get into the global marketplace without effective rail service. And remember, if we don't act, if we don't do something, if we don't approve this Biden approved, Walsh approved negotiated settlement right now for the TA levels, then you know what? The rail system is going to have to begin to prepare for that strike. And that means that's pretty immediate. It's not like in a few days. They're not going to wait till December 9th at 12:01 a.m. They're going to begin preparing for this now. So this is a big deal. This is why, unfortunately, we're being asked to do it. Terrible precedent, but in the end, it's a necessity to approve the agreement that the Biden administration wants us to approve.
And Mr. Davis, I agree. I am very, very concerned that this is something we should not be doing, that is in our business, and disappointed that the Biden administration couldn't make this work, couldn't figure something out. And Mr. Payne, you had a statement you wanted to make.
Oh.
And I'm sorry, I just,
Oh, no, thank you. I apologize for, on your time. It was just, I wanted to just clarify that it's 70,000 workers that are impacted by this, which is half of the rail workforce in these 4 unions. And, you know, we got here, you know, because the problem is railroads cut the workforce by nearly 1/3, more work for the remaining workers to do, attendance policies that penalize workers for being sick. Workers wanted sick pay, sick time, and that is the issue. It wasn't the increase. The 24% is incredible, but their issue, their concern was sick time and being able to be there for their children and their families. And so, you know, we really need to look at this in a humanistic way. I mean, who doesn't get sick? We're all human beings. And that the railroads cannot find their way in accommodating their workforce that is working hard, that kept this country going during this pandemic, is really a sin. And the railroads are the ones that brought us to this point today. And I yield back.
and maybe I can just ask one follow-up question on that. The sick days would not be, my understanding is they are not included, that they are looking for. Okay, and Mr. Davis is saying no. So the sick days that are the biggest issue are not here.
No,
Okay.
no,
It
they're
has not been addressed.
It's not being addressed. The Biden
Railroad
administration.
refused.
Not a side letter,
Well, the
nothing
Biden
like that?
administration told us, did not ask this institution to address that.
Okay.
Now, the majority could choose to, but I don't think that's the route that they're going to take.
Just wanted to make sure. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure we're using our words, choosing our words appropriately. Everyone said we don't like this precedent. I mean, we may not like this process, but this is not without precedent, as Mr. Payne pointed out. So, I mean, I agree that this is the process none of us really want to have to be faced with, but it is not without precedent.
Mr. Chair, I'm willing to change all of my references to
absolutely.
precedent to process now.
The record will reflect that. All right, Ms. Scanlon?
Hi, I'm actually on a train right now, but the connection is bad and so is the noise, so I will refrain from further comment at this time. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli?
Yeah, I remember when my kids were young, and I'd say something at the dinner table that probably my wife was going to respond to because I was egging her on, and the kids used to say, "Ma, don't take the bait, don't take the bait." So we had this idea, you shouldn't respond to everything, but I'm going to violate my own rules here and just take the bait a little bit. I don't think the President and the Secretary of Labor need me or anyone else to defend their actions. And I'll admit to not having any special information. I wasn't involved in any of this, just observing as my fellow Americans are observing. But the criticism here, to me, just seems incredibly unfounded. You could have disagreements about a whole host of things in life, and you could have disagreements about what you think should or should not happen from a lens of what role the government ought to play or not. But as I understand it, first of all, you're dealing with a relatively unique situation, which is you have 12 different labor unions. And I'm sure there's many times you have negotiations with multiple labor unions, but this is 12. That's a pretty significant bar to have to get over, is get ratification from all 12. And you also, it's somewhat unique, and this is an industry where you're not talking about a local, you're talking about a national industry, and it's also one that literally can cripple the nation's economy. So I'm sure there may be parallels, maybe the airline industry, maybe there's a handful, but it would be pretty rare for the President of the United States and the Labor Secretary have to even step into the middle of this back just, I don't know, 6 weeks ago or so when they got involved in it. And it seemed to me at the time it was very appropriate for the President and the Secretary of Labor recognizing the consequences for the economy, the consequences for supply chain, the consequences for moving goods and materials around the country, that they actually get involved rather than waiting to a point where we're at a crisis or we're at a strike. So they appropriately got involved, as I understand, helped broker this, although clearly the unions and the rail companies were at the table. They negotiate a deal that gets the approval of, I think it's 8 different unions. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Payne. And the ones that didn't were pretty close. As I haven't looked at all the numbers, but very close. I think even some of the ones that ratified were close. And as I think people have appropriately pointed out, less typically wages and benefits and more around working conditions. And again, sort of the unique nature of the rail industry and the unique way in which people are required to be scheduled, et cetera. So you go through this process, acting in good faith, and at the end of the day, we have systems of making sure that, the union members had the opportunity to ratify. They chose not to do it. And here we are. I think it's clearly a position that no one seems comfortable with. That's understandable. No one here wants to impose these kinds of decisions on people. But what is also interesting is it's almost a necessity. Everyone who may be speaking about the process or taking opportunities to criticize the president or the labor secretary also aren't voicing opposition to the legislation because they know it's something we have to do. The same way that the president and the White House and the administration knows it is something we need to do to avert what would be a crippling economic catastrophe for this country while we face challenges of supply chain interruptions, while we see what's happening around the world, what we see what's happening in Ukraine, around energy prices, all of which have affected inflationary pressures in this country and around the world, and those may be deepening with what's going on in China. So I don't think anybody sees this as optimal. No one wants to do this. I'm sure if we had the ability to negotiate a different deal, we would. But could you imagine that? We can't negotiate an omnibus deal to fund the government, and you want to add now the negotiation of labor contracts? I mean, so we're in a position where we have to do what responsible people do. It's like raising the debt limit. It's like a lot of things that no one wants to do, but if you're going to have an organized civil government, you have to do these things. And this is one of those things that I think qualifies and meets that test. But I frankly find it frustrating that the criticism of the president, who doesn't need my defense, as I said, nor does the labor secretary, I think they acted in a very thoughtful, responsible, measured manner. They've taken this as far as they could go and let the parties try to work it out. Failing to do that, it's now up to us to make sure that we move ahead. But so I rise to the bait, and I'm going to support the rule in the underlying legislation, regretfully, because I don't think there's anybody here who wants to do it, but I think it's necessary if we're going to be able to meet our obligations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Terrific. Any other questions for the panel? Oh, Ed Perlmutter has one. Oh, Mr. DeSania, do you have a question?
Nope, I like to associate myself with the comments by Mr. Morelli, and I yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter.
So I just was looking at the proposed bill, and it refers to the Railway Labor Act of 45 U.S.C. 151. I'm just trying to find the part where it goes to the president. The president says, accept this arbitration or this mediation, and then the part where it comes to Congress. Can somebody help me? Oh, sorry about that. So my question is, what section of it refers this whole process to Congress to approve or disapprove? That's just a...
Section 10.
Section 10 of 151, 45 U.S.C. 151, what? Go.
Section 10 of the Act.
Okay. All right.
Getting it for you, sir.
I'll get it afterwards, sorry. All right. I'll yield back.
Section one,
Oh, good.
section 160.
Section 160, okay, thank you.
All right.
All right. There are no other questions of this panel. You're free to go.
Thank you.
And we'll see you again a few more times before the end of the year. All right. At this time, we're going to close the hearing portion of this meeting and recess our Rules Committee and reconvene our Members' Day hearing. And so now I want to call up a panel, Ms. Bordeaux, Representative Bordeaux, Representative Radewagen, Representative Davidson, Representative Timmons, Representative Latta. So come up and Representative Bordeaux, will begin with you, so wherever you. Just make sure your mic is on, yeah, okay. Okay, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the House Rules Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the potential rules changes for the 118th Congress. While I will not be here, I am here to express my support for strengthening pay-as-you-go rules and restoring a sense of fiscal discipline in Congress. Prior to running for Congress, I spent most of my professional career working to advance fiscally responsible policies at the local, state, and federal level. Over the years, I've worked on a number of projects evaluating state fiscal discipline and budget processes, and for years I have taught public budgeting. And from 2007 to 2010, I served as director of the Georgia Senate Budget and Evaluation Office, where I worked with members from both parties to balance the state budget during the Great Recession. At the state level, states work under balanced budget requirements, which means that budget choices involve trade-offs. An increase in one part of the budget requires a revenue increase or spending decrease in another part of the budget. While researchers often invoke the balanced budget requirements as the reason that state budgets are balanced and the federal budget is not, in fact, these state budget balance requirements are quite easy to violate. They are enforced not so much because of the letter of the law, but because many state governments have developed a culture of fiscal responsibility that honors the spirit of the law. What I saw in Georgia during the Great Recession was that legislators, despite enormous political pressures, generally adhered to good fiscal practices and would invoke policies like the balanced budget requirements to push back against policy proposals that would have had the effect of undermining fiscal stability. We need to restore both the rules and culture that support fiscal responsibility in Congress. The pay-go rule is a key check on congressional spending. However, at this point, it seems like it is waived so often that it's not even a speed bump in the face of each party's spending or revenue priorities. As we face historic inflation, it will become important for the long-term economic health of the nation that future Congresses restore regular order around decisions that increase the deficit and by extension add to our national debt. There are several ways in which the 118th Congress can reinforce and strengthen our commitment to fiscal responsibility. First, remove the broad pay-go exemption categories, like exemptions for tax cuts or COVID or climate spending, as has been done by both parties in recent Congresses. In the Inflation Reduction Act, we showed that we can responsibly pay for and offset critical investments to lower the cost of health care and address the effects of climate change. We just have to choose to do so. Require a standalone vote to waive pay-go. Too often, bills are passed under rules which waive pay-go and remove the need for the House to debate the fiscal cost of legislation we are considering. Requiring a standalone vote to waive pay-go would mean that members have to debate and consider the cost of legislation that we have to pass. Finally, require bills on the consensus calendar to be deficit neutral. The consensus calendar is a tool for members to bring widely supported, non-controversial bills to the House for consideration. However, this Congress, we have seen several bills added to the consensus calendar, which would have fiscal impacts in the tens of billions of dollars. Requiring the consensus calendar to be deficit neutral is a simple way we can ensure that legislation that adds to the deficit can be appropriately considered and debated in Congress. We know that Congress can act in a fiscally responsible manner and improve and expand upon pay-go rules and principles because we have done it before. Statutory pay-go was created in 1990 as part of the bipartisan budget agreement, which sought to address the large deficits our nation was facing. Shortly thereafter, I came to Congress as a staff member, and during the ensuing years, we made great progress towards getting our nation on a more sustainable fiscal trajectory, even enjoying budget surpluses in some years, all the while allowing for new investments in CHIP, the child tax credit, and the earned income tax credit. As you know, the pay-go rule was later created in 2007 rather than the statutory pay-go, which looks at aggregate spending each year. The pay-go rule requires members to consider the fiscal impact of individual legislation as it is considered and passed. If you enhance the pay-go rule and other important budget constraints, this forces a debate about priorities and trade-offs for any piece of legislation, and in my long experience working at the local, state, and federal level, generally leads to better policymaking. Thank you again to Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and the members of the House Rules Committee for the opportunity to discuss this important issue with you today. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Representative Radewagen.
I want to thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, for allowing me to testify today. Today, I come to testify in support of keeping the House rule that allows the delegate and resident commissioner the vote in the Committee of the Whole. This has been a right that delegates have had since the earliest days of our republic. In fact, our 9th president, William Henry Harrison, was a delegate for the Northwest Territory and was able to chair the Committee of the Whole at times. And as you know, the Northwest Territory later turned into the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Bottom line is, a committee is a committee, whether it be a standing committee that we most frequently engage with, a special committee for one purpose or another, or the Committee of the Whole, which allows votes for amendments, just like a standing committee. This matter was litigated 30 years ago, and I take no issue with the fact that the House indeed has complete right to make its own rules under the Constitution. The current rule is not an encroachment on states' rights, nor does it dilute members' voting rights or apportionment from the states' voting as decided by the federal courts. Consistency, plain and simple, is all I ask for the constituents of the territories, to have a consistent vote in all committees and not have to explain to puzzled constituents why we have this vote in some Congresses but not others. Thank you for hearing me out on this, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Representative Davidson.
Thank you, Chairman, and I appreciate the members that are here and online from the Rules Committee. And just I think it's great that you have this member day. And I think personally, we like to think that the Rules Committee is maybe the most important thing we decide, because the House sets its own rules, and those rules are supposed to apply to everyone. Of course, we have a well-honored tradition of waiving the rules for virtually every vote. So in the spirit that we want the rules to matter, I guess I'm here to offer that we might actually be able to operate the place, more productively. And I think it's great to see that so many colleagues took the time to draft rules that offer their take on how we might actually, operate this place more productively. So I provided, to Mrs. Torres's comment to Mr. Griffin, a summary of my amendments here that I'm offering today. And they're numbered, I guess I've offered 125 amendments as of the one I'm going to speak to you about first in this Congress. This first amendment would require us to have a recorded vote on a budget resolution that balances. Since I've been in Congress, I've only voted on one budget that ever balances. Of course, that was not an aggressive bill. I think it balanced in 10 or 15 years. Members of both parties called it an austerity plan, and we moved forward to continue to spend well beyond what we were collecting in tax revenue. So to be sure, both parties would have different approaches. In general, stereotypically, Democrats would tax our way to a balanced budget, and Republicans would cut our way to a balanced budget.
And the compromise has been a bipartisan solution that is bankrupting our country. So I don't know that we could get yet to a point where we are going to bind ourselves that we have to balance the budget, but at least we could vote on a budget that balances. It doesn't say it has to balance in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. It doesn't say how you have to do it, but you do have to have a recorded vote before you can go on to appropriations. And it's important that our country has this constraint on government because, you know, fundamentally the willingness to pay the taxes at the end of the day is supposed to be a restraint on the size of government. People shouldn't get more government than they're willing to pay for. And right now, they're overdosing on too much government, or at least overdosing on too much spending without offset. So this is a step in that direction, and I hope that it becomes part of the rules for the 118th Congress. The next is an acknowledgement that earmarks are popular with many of our colleagues. I don't personally think we should have earmarks. We debate about what those are. I don't think it's wrong for Congress to say that, you know, we're going to direct the Army Corps of Engineers to prioritize works on locks or dams or something. But I do think that when we decide that Congress should fund a Gandhi Museum in Houston, Texas, for example, that probably meets everyone's definition of an earmark. And the only requirement here for my amendment number 126 is that it has to have a standalone measure. You can't attach it to appropriations bills. So if you're proud of the Gandhi Museum, you want us all to build from Ohio and Houston, Texas, then put it on the floor and we'll be glad to vote for it. Of course, I'd vote no, and I suspect everyone else would. And that's why they don't go with the transparent path on earmarks. So I don't know if anyone's mind would be persuaded on that, but it's a way to say, sure, by all means, offer your earmark. Just do it transparently and give us a straight up or down vote on it. My amendment number 127, I think would be one of the most consequential amendments for Congress and for solving a problem for the country, which is this body needs a health care committee. Health care is one of the most broken problems in our country. It's clearly divisive in terms of how we approach it in a partisan way. But when I looked at, before I really got to Congress, I don't think I appreciated how much committee structure explains why so many solutions are kind of half measures at best. And a lot of it's because committees of jurisdiction can only go so far to solve certain problems. You know, the Energy and Commerce Committee has a massive jurisdiction, as does Ways and Means. But historically, the House Financial Services Committee was part of Energy and Commerce. But financial services became a substantial and very specialized area, and it emerged from Energy and Commerce and became its own committee. Healthcare is, you know, right around 20% of GDP at this point. If you look at most households, if it's not the largest expense in the household, it's the second largest behind rent or mortgage. It's one of the leading, if not the leading, causes of bankruptcy in the United States. For small businesses, it's crippling them. And every year goes by, we see Democrats in lockstep in general saying, we're not going to fix anything because it takes away from the momentum for single payer, and we see Republicans continue to be divided. In general, any organization you're going to be a part of that's meant to solve problems aligns responsibility and authority so that there can be accountability. And I suspect that if we would align responsibility and authority, although we would initially come into the meeting with different perspectives, given the partisan nature of this, we would at least have ownership. The chairman of that committee would own the responsibility for making health care in America better each Congress. And so I think we should do that. I respect that it would change things a lot, and frankly, that's what the American people want. It's not necessarily what the lobbyists want. They've donated generously to preserve the status quo, and it's pretty broken. Everyone in the country realizes it's broken, and I think the clear signal we could send that we hear you is that we're going to create ownership over that and create a health care committee. My amendment number 128 would allow a staffer from each personal office to have a top secret SCI clearance. Right now it stops at top secret. It does not get to the SCI level. And you know, we often run into things in every member's office that frankly we should probably know a lot more about. That's a different problem. But in theory, there's not a cap on the level of classification we can be read in on. But we all know how important it is to have staff support for that work, and often you can't have staff support from your own staff. So this would just prioritize the work to get SCI clearances for every member who wants them. There's no mandate that you have to get one. But if you're doing work for your committee that would regularly involve some sort of clearance issue, you should be able to get an SCI clearance. And the default should be that every member has that kind of level of support. My amendment number 129 would require a recorded vote for spending bills. CBO scores any spending over $500,000, or they're supposed to. They don't always. And so if you're going to spend more, you're going to spend something that has a CBO, it should require a recorded vote. So there are a lot of bills that go through here, spend a lot of money, and they just go without a recorded vote. And then I think the last amendment that I've got doesn't have an amendment number, and it's called the CBO Show Your Work Act, because it doesn't amend the rules, it just incorporates a bill that I've had into the rules. And this deals with how the Congressional Budget Office, whenever they publish a score, the one thing we know is that it will be wrong. We don't know for sure how wrong it'll be, but it's meant to be an approximation, it's an estimate. Sometimes it's wildly wrong. When the federal government took over education funding as part of Dodd-Frank, they said it would save us $60-some billion. The reality is we know it's going to cost us closer to $500 billion when we count up all the defaults. The question is, how do we remedy that? We're having a debate. The public never gets to see the models for these. Every now and then, selectively, they'll reveal this. Often, when we're in the midst of debate, regular member offices can't even get the CBO model so that you could say, well, I have an idea for amendment. How would it do it? Well, you can't even get in the queue, especially if you're not on the committee of jurisdiction. Some of these bills are hugely consequential. If they were required to publish their models and protect proprietary sensitive information, but publish their models, then they could get input, not just from every member in this body, but from anyone that wants to participate, whether it's academics or professionals that would build models that would say, I think you have a flaw in your model. You've got an assumption that we're questioning. And we'd have a better model. We'd make more accurate decisions. And I think it'd be an important way for us to improve the function of the body. So it's a long list. I could go longer, but I narrowed it down to these. Thanks for the time of the committee.
Thank you. Mr. Latta.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and members of the Rules Committee. Thanks for today for having the Members' Day hearing for the rules changes in the 118th. Mine is a very, very short amendment that we do. It would prohibit having the ability to put a title including in the short titles and introduced legislation. And so you only have just the bill number or the resolution number, and that's it. And for me and for others through the years, I think it's important because, again, I think a lot of things have changed. It used to be an area that you'd be able to say, you know what, okay, this is an easy way for people to remember such and such bill. But through the years, these titles and these acronyms, and I'm not sure how long some of our staff have to work on some of these things to come up with them, but they can be weaponized against other members of the House. And not only that, it confuses our constituents back home because all of a sudden they say, well, how could you vote against X piece of legislation? Because they cite you back what the title is, and it says that's not what it was. And so I think it's important that a member could go home and you can talk about your bill any way you want to. You can call it anything you want, but you don't have it in the title of the legislation. And so we just go back to just a simple way it was done. You just have your bill, and then the bill number, bill resolution number, and that's it. And that's all this would do, because I think it really would help us in our way that we operate around here. You're not weaponizing, again, that piece of legislation. We're not confusing our constituents. We're not, also, and sometimes, it makes it tough for members to vote on a piece of legislation when they hear a certain bill title. They say, well, how am I going to vote for that? How do I explain that? So you don't have to worry about that. And the other thing it's going to do, it's going to save us money, because if you're not voting for something that's got a lot of money attached to it, and you say, well, how could I vote against that? Well, you don't have to, because it's not in the bill title. And so it's up, it's up to the member who would want to use it. They can go home, they can talk about their bill. But in this case, what this would do is, again, in this rules package,
would just prohibit the inclusion of short titles and introduce legislation. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Timmons?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. Over the last 4 years, I've been on the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. First 2 as a member, last 2 as vice chair. It has been some of the most rewarding work I've ever done in my life. Appreciate you loaning Congressman Perlmutter and Congressman Reschenthaler to us. We've gotten a lot done the last 2 years. We made 202 recommendations over the last 4 years. 132 of them have had substantial implementation. The one that I want to speak on is about committee calendars and schedules. So right now, the chairman of every committee is in charge of scheduling their subcommittees and full hearings and markups as they see fit. The recommendation that we made was not to require anything other than to just use one portal so you can see the conflicts. You don't have to, it's not instructive, it's not, you don't have to change anything that a committee chairman currently does other than to input them into this new portal so everybody can see conflicts. For example, average last Congress, 40.2 conflicts every day. Average member serves on 4.5 committees and subcommittees. It's just a lot of chaos, and we're trying to find a way to just see conflicts. Hopefully that will facilitate conversations in the future regarding block scheduling that would allow us to deconflict committee schedules. I said I'll be brief, so I'll leave it at that. But again, we're not asking that rules does anything other than force committees to put their schedules into this new portal so we can just see everything and go from there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank you for your testimony, Vice Chair Timmons, and I want to thank you and Rep. Kilmer for the incredible bipartisan work that you and members of the Select Committee have have done, that was created as part of our rules package, and it was originally envisioned as just kind of a one-term thing, but we extended it to 2 terms because there's a lot of good work that gets done there, and it's in a climate where people can have discussions that don't kind of delve into partisanship, and so I want to thank all of you and your hardworking staff for all the work that you've done. You guys have paved the way for enhanced and unified telework practices and key technology changes that have stood the test of time. And as you mentioned, we have Mr. Perlmutter, who's I think Ms. Scanlon has been on the committee, and Mr. Reschenthaler. And I just want to take the time to thank you for your incredible work, and I hope that when the majority put their rules package together, that the work that you guys have been doing gets to continue. And Representative Bordeaux, thank you for your service to the Congress. We're sad to see you go, and we appreciate your insight here today, but your many contributions. And Representative Davidson, thank you for your exhaustive list of recommendations, but I know that they're all offered in the spirit of trying to make this institution better. And Representative Radowagen, I agree with you. That's why we extended in our rules package, what you're requesting, and I hope that the new majority will do the same thing. And Representative Leonard, thank you. I mean, I really haven't thought much about your amendment, but I remember being in the minority, and some of the titles that the Republicans came up with for their bills, I didn't think were necessarily accurate of what we were voting on, but nonetheless were, kind of to the average person, who's not paying attention to the substance of the bill, but just the title. Sometimes it's difficult to explain, and I do think we got to figure out ways to move away from this kind of gotcha mentality, where we're constantly trying to put people into a corner, rather than having thoughtful discussions about the substance of legislation. So, again, I appreciate all of you being here. Let me yield to Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses. Very thoughtful suggestions you've brought forward. Mr. Timmons, I'm particularly intrigued by your deconflicting strategy. Fundamentally opposed to cloning, but there have been several occasions where I feel like I have to clone myself to be in 2 subcommittee hearings and a rules hearing at the same time. I don't know how it would work as a practical matter. Someone would have to pay attention to it, and I don't know, that may be a bridge too far, but I'm intrigued that you've at least given it some thought and tried to give us a practical, workable solution. Do you have any ideas to how it would actually be enforced?
So right now, the CAO and the clerk's office are working they have a number of requests for proposals out to give us the actual, it's essentially an app. And once the portal is created, it would create a common calendar that all the committees would have to put their information into, so you could just see. And ideally, eventually, we would get to the point where we would have, like middle schools do, block scheduling, where certain committees meet during certain times. Unfortunately, rules is never going to be perfect. We're never going to be able to dictate. It's just not going to work. But the rest of the committees can make serious strides. My big thing is evidence-based policymaking in a collaborative manner from a position of mutual respect. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We don't do that because we never actually go back and forth. 4 years in Congress, I've gone back and forth once, and that's with Perlmutter in a subcommittee hearing for financial institutions on financial services. And that was one time in 4 years. And we had a great experience, and we learned a lot, but we sat there for 2 hours. I've only been in one committee hearing for 2 hours, and it was that one, because I have to go all these different places. So just putting it all in one place is step one. And once we see all the different conflicts, sometimes I would imagine a committee chair would say, oh, well, it looks like 3/4 of my committee has a conflict right now, and it looks like we're better up here. We could just do that. Maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't. But if we get everything into one portal, we can then create possibly an algorithm or possibly block scheduling that will help deconflict. That's the idea, and I just think this is the first step in exploring it. I think we all want to be in our committee hearings. This is just the first step in the right direction.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm reminded of when I first got here, the Rules Committee, I think, met at 11 o'clock at night, which probably wouldn't be a step forward in this.
How lucky you are you have me.
Yes.
Right.
And Mr. Davidson, the Show Your Work amendment on the CBO, perhaps as a corollary to that, and one of the things I've learned over the years, the answer you get depends upon how you ask the question. And it took me a long time to learn that, in many meetings with the CBO, to figure out the inner workings of their process. So you're right, I think it could be a great deal more transparent, and members would actually get factual information that they could actually use. And that, I think, would be a step in that direction. So thank you for bringing that forward. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
And let me just say, I think another way that would make committee work easier is if we didn't call for roll call votes on every single non-controversial bill. And I hope that we don't follow the example that has been made by some people in this current session, because the bottom line is that it interferes with committee work. And committee work is some of the most important work that gets done around here. It's not what always happens on the floor, it's what happens in committee. Who am I? Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the panelists for your testimony. I serve on a lot of committees with all of you. We've got 5 members of the Modernization of Congress Committee in the room right now, and one of the things that did come up constantly was scheduling conflicts, and so that I know that's why you highlighted that, but there are probably another dozen suggestions from our committee in the rules change requests that have been made. I mean, everything, Mr. Davidson and I agree on a lot of different things. We disagree on some things, and one of the main points you brought up was the scope of health care on our budget, on our issues that we face here in the Congress, and whether or not, you know, there should be something just dedicated to that. In my opinion, I think you're right, because it takes up so much time and space and cost from a federal perspective, but in everybody's lives. So I just appreciate the suggestions that have been made. Mr. Latta and I differ on some questions concerning compensation, which I wish were in these suggestions that were made to the Rules Committee as to housing allowances and per diems, and whether or not we have a dual duty station, which is something that only Congress faces, and For those of you that don't understand what dual duty station means, I didn't know what it meant until it was explained to us in our committee. In Congress, unlike any place else in the federal government or in the military, where you live is your primary duty station. And if you go outside of that, you're entitled to per diem, except with respect to Congress, where we have a dual duty station. It can make some sense, but not really. It says you have two primary duty stations, your home and Washington. Therefore, you're not entitled to a per diem. But obviously, it gets expensive over the years, maintaining two homes, especially one of them being here in Washington, D.C. So I appreciate all of the suggestions that have been delivered to the Rules Committee from the Select Committee. I wish we would have seen a little more on the compensation for members, but we have, I think, till Christmas. I don't know, when are we supposed to get out of here? The 16th, but probably more like Christmas?
Yeah, January 2nd.
To work on, January 2nd, okay. To work on some compensation matters that I think would benefit the institution. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want the record to reflect that that's actually my favorite flavor of polar water.
Oh.
So Christmas is coming, not so
It's
subtle.
it's actually made in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I come from. Yeah.
You got to have some fun. And Mr. Perlmutter, for the third time today, I'm going to associate myself with your remarks. Well said, my friend. Mr. Timmons, I just want to, just a quick anecdote. I don't know if you remember this, but real early when we got to Congress, you got really frustrated on the floor and you just threw your hands up and like, we got to fix this. And I think it's amazing that 4 years later, you've actually fixed a lot of the things that you were complaining about within literally the first 2 or 3 weeks of us being here. So not everybody can say that. So congrats to you and everything you did on ModCom. It's been an honor to serve with you on that committee. Mr. Lotta, love your idea about the naming. Incredible idea. Mr. Davidson, we're just not going to agree on earmarks, but I don't want to belabor the point. So with that, I'm going to yield back.
All right. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to also associate myself again with Mr. Perlmutter. You know, I have the benefit of being an empty nester, and in terms of financial compensation, it's really not an issue here. But I think for younger members with small families, small children, particularly those who are traveling all across the country, I think the lack of congressional will to have a cost of living adjustment or somehow to compensate members for costs. I know this is not very popular. No one's going to, you know, jump up and down about it, but I think this is a missed opportunity to do something to fix it. I think when there are private sector jobs that are paying 3-4 times what members make, and there's half, you know, some members come here with an eye already on how they're going to monetize their service here, you're not going to get rich as a member of Congress. That's not the point of it. But I think it is when you have, you know, maintained 2 households, you don't get the benefit of tax break. I really think in terms of modernizing and encouraging people who are mid-career to come here, to leave what they do as their chosen profession to represent communities with no guarantee that they're going to be able to stay here for a long time or that they'll even want to, but to go back into their profession is a hardship. And I think to really, you know, again, I know it's not popular. I know no one's going to jump up and down. We're not going to get a letter signed on with 300 members calling for it. But I just think we are going to make it harder and harder to attract talented people to come to Congress if you're not willing to compensate people for something that's not in what they would make in the private sector, but it's commensurate with other federal officials, federal judges and others who make significantly more. And I don't think it's, I think this is a missed opportunity. Again, I'm not speaking for me personally, I've been blessed. But for a lot of other members, I think it's got to be a real struggle, and you would want them to be able to serve without having to make significant financial sacrifices to be here. As it relates to the amendments, again, I want to thank people for their thoughtfulness about what they bring here. Mr. Timmons and Mr. Kilmer and the committee have done, I think, a really solid job. I may not agree with all of the amendments and all of the thoughts, but I think it's really thoughtful about how to move us forward. I also wanted to commend the idea of having the health care committee. I think that, you know, healthcare has now become such an important part of the American economy. Frankly, you know, although there are 50 different states that all, you know, regulate it differently, when it comes to ERISA plans and a lot of what we do, it's now becoming a national agenda item. And I think dividing it up by multiple committees that have jurisdiction, whether it's Ed and Labor or Energy and Commerce or Ways and Means, I just think it's a disservice. It's really hard to have a thoughtful conversation about healthcare policy in the United States when you have multiple committees weighing in. And I just think, given the growth in what it means to GDP, and frankly, we're going to be, and I say this a lot back home talking about Medicare, Social Security, we're entering a stage in American life where 2/3 of baby boomers are now in Medicare. It's going to be the other third will be in the next 6 or 7 years. It's going to put an enormous burden and responsibility on those programs, and to think about how to provide health care in a way that has better outcomes from a healthcare point of view, from a medical point of view, how you lower costs, how you make sure that patients have a system that values them, and also providers have a system that values them, the so-called quadruple aim of healthcare. I don't see any meaningful efforts at getting to a better system here, and I think that's partly because of the way we've designed the Congress and the way that we deal with these responsibilities. So I'm sure my friends who are committee chairs of the jurisdictions that have it now probably wouldn't want to hear it, but I think it's something we really ought to give serious thought to, and I want to thank you for recommending that as well, and I'll yield back.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just like to talk a little bit, or just kind of add to what Mr. Morelli was talking about with the healthcare issue. I was shocked when I got here and there wasn't a committee just devoted to that, because it is such a gigantic issue. And so I agree. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Morelli. So, you know, we messed up this.
To continue that thought in the months and years ahead.
Well, I just wanted to mess up the trend of, associating myself with Mr. Perlmutter. So I just kind of changing things up a little bit to keep people awake. But the other thing that I really, really like is the scheduling issue, because again, I was shocked when I got here that it seemed like every one of my committees met at the exact same time. I mean, there was never a chance to, make sure that you got to them. And so that I think some kind of scheduling, if it's block or whatever, or just some kind of coordination, makes so much more sense, because it's disappointing when you're not able to stay at a committee the entire time, because you're on the committee because you're interested in the topic and you want to make sure that you're there. So appreciate bringing that forward, and the healthcare issue too. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yield back.
Any other questions of this panel? Seeing none, you are free to go. Thank you very much. Representative Kamak, Representative Massey, Representative Joyce. Do you want to go first? Do you want to go first? Okay. All right. So how about you want to go, Mr. Joyce? Why don't we go first? Okay. People are coming and going. I'm having a tough time keeping track of everybody. Thanks. You may begin. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment that would establish a bipartisan ethics task force to conduct a comprehensive review of the ethics rules and regulations and report the recommended improvements to the bipartisan leadership. Why now, you might ask? Well, it's been 30 years since the House established a comprehensive ethics task force to improve its rules and regulations. The last time this was done in 1989 by then Speaker Jim Wright and later Bob Michael. The 1997 and 2007 task force were process, not rules-focused. The rules should be improved to ensure members are not personally profiting from their official position. If the current rules allow a member to accept a $35,000 charity event ticket for free, it's time to change the rules. If the current rules allow a member to sell for any price his or her life story as intellectual property, it is time to change the rules. If the current rules allow a member to accept a wedding gift of any value from a lobbyist and not disclose the gift, it's time to change the rules. The rules should be improved and to reduce the confusion and promote compliance. Example 1, there's 3 different rules to apply to 3 different posts that you may put out on social media. Now remember, 30 years ago, we didn't have social media. So for official press releases, the 72-hour rule applies before the same language can appear on campaign social media without taking the original press release down from the official site. From press outlet videos, videos quoting, referencing, or featuring a member of Congress, the exhausted use test applies, and your office gets to decide when an interview or video has exhausted its official use and can be posted by the campaign, and this can be less than 72 hours. For social media posts, these posts not in the form of a press release, neither the 72-hour rule nor the exhausted use test apply. For another example, in September, the committee announced a guest policy for change in attendance at events. Before the change, the type of event you were attending determined the type of guest you could take, maybe a spouse, a staffer, an adult child, or a minor child. We have a chart here that gives you the different examples of different events in all the different ways in which someone might or might not be eligible to be able to attend with you. I think the times have changed as well on that type of example. But it's confusing how a simple invitation to an event, now a member can take any kind of guest to any of these 7 different types of event. Lastly, how would the task force be set up? Equally bipartisan, similar to the Ethics Committee, with 3 Republicans and 3 Democrat current members, and 2 bipartisan former members serving in an ex officio capacity, participating in a substantive conversation, but not voting on the recommendations. The task force staff would include current ethics and House Administration Committee staff. They will conduct a comprehensive review of ethic rules and regulations. The task force will complete recommended improvements, report the recommended improvements to the bipartisan leadership, and all will take a confidentiality oath on the things that they listen to, hear, see, or do during the time of putting together such a commission.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Carmack?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the members here today for the opportunity to speak. Several of the amendments before you, I'm just speaking. Yes. Oh, there it is. I thought it was already on. So I'm glad the committee is hosting this hearing today, as the rules of the House affects all members and their ability to best represent their constituents. House rules probably isn't the most interesting topic for people back home, but trust me, everything that we do here in the House, debate, offer bills, amendments, our committee activity, it is dictated by the House rules. And I think it's fair to say that many across this country feel that this place is broken. So we're starting here with rules. The most important part of this job is casting a vote on each bill on the House floor on behalf of our constituents, deciding whether or not it should become law or not. This responsibility should never be taken lightly, as each bill has the potential to impact Americans all across this country. Every member should have the opportunity to know the content of each bill that is considered, its cost, and how it will impact their constituents. It's a very simple concept. That means every member of Congress should, at minimum, have the opportunity to read each measure prior to consideration. However, in current practice, we often find ourselves with mere hours to read the bills that are hundreds or even thousands of pages long. Lately, I have found that the longer the bill is, the less time that members have to read it. Providing members with sufficient time to read each bill is one method to ensure that every member of Congress, on behalf of their constituents, has made the best decision. In the 118th Congress, we should strengthen the rules of the House to give members of this body time to analyze and read each piece of legislation. This rule should be upheld for every bill with no exceptions or waivers unless 2/3 of the majority support. I strongly support this change to House rules and request its inclusion as part of the House rules next Congress. And I'd also like to touch briefly on single-issue bills. In the same vein, I believe another necessary change to House rules that would strengthen members' input in the legislative process is limiting bills to single issues. This change would bring much-needed transparency to Congress for members and the public alike, and it would ultimately expedite the legislative process.
Since I have been in Congress, the most expensive and consequential bills are massive and touch every single issue. In such bills, there are policies throughout that would have broad support of Republicans and Democrats alike, but each include riders that require members to tacitly decide if the good outweighs the bad. I can't tell you how many times I've had to go home and say, it was all bad, but I had to decide which was worse. Legislating in such a way is frustrating to me, to our colleagues, and certainly to our constituents. Each policy should be considered on its own merits separately. The House Rules Committee should require that every bill be single issue, focusing on one subject at a time. In doing so, members can easily discern the policy being considered and cast their vote. And on a personal note, I would say that I probably wouldn't be here in Congress today had it not been for a program created through one of these massive bills that was rushed through on the House floor. In 2008, the Home Affordable Modification Program, as many of you know it, HAMP, was included in a bill that was hundreds of pages long and modified numerous federal policies. This program was a disaster and ultimately cost millions of homeowners across the country their homes. However, this provision, like every provision we vote on in Congress, should have been considered on its own merits. And legislators should have had the opportunity to debate this program, but they didn't. The American people deserve representatives who have the opportunity to read, debate, and consider each policy on its merits. And had this been the case for the HAMP program, it is possible that my family, along with the 6 million other families across the country, we might not have lost our homes. Again, I believe that single-issue bills will bring much-needed transparency to the legislative process and restore the broken trust in this institution. I encourage the committee to include this change in the 118th rules of the House. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak on these recommendations today, and I would also like to associate myself with the comments that Representative Massey is about to deliver, so thank you.
Boy, that's a good license.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to change the topic of what I was going to speak.
Yeah, I don't even know what you're going to say,
That's
but
dangerous. We're living dangerously.
Mr. Massey.
I do want to associate myself with the remarks that Ms. Kamek made, because we sat down here and realized that we were making the same proposal. It must mean it's a great proposal to change the rules. The American people, this proposal is for the American people. I haven't found a single American who disagrees with this proposal. In fact, I'm a little bit embarrassed at how modest it is, because back home they're going to say that doesn't go far enough. Yet here, I'm afraid it's going to seem radical and take a lot of work to convince people to adopt it. But it would increase the integrity of this House, and the work product would be better that comes out of it. My amendment is simple. We have a lot of rules here, very good rules. I just think we should follow one of these rules more frequently. And so what my amendment would do is require a 2/3 vote of the full House to waive the current 72-hour rule that gives us 72 hours to read the bill. Now, a little bit of history on the 72-hour rule. It used to be a 3-day rule under Republicans. And I would guess a lot of the reasons you were here at 11 o'clock at night is the text of the bill was not available until 11:50 on the first day, but the parliamentarian said that counts as a day in our 3-day rule, and so we could shorten it. And then on the third day, we would vote in the morning, and so you could collapse the 3-day rule into maybe a 30-hour rule. The Democrats, I have to give you credit.
Thank you.
I will probably never do this again. But you changed it from a 3-day rule, which we cheated on all the time, into a 72-hour rule, which required an honest-to-goodness 3 days, 72 hours between when the text was available and when we voted on it. And I was a little bit incredulous at the time because it seemed like such a good change to me, something I had advocated for a long time. But it wasn't but a few weeks until that rule got suspended, and then regularly has been suspended for 4 years. And so I think if we put this 2/3 requirement in before suspending that rule, that will help things. The 2/3 requirement on the 72-hour rule would include
floor votes on bills that go through regular order, floor votes on bills that bypass committees and go directly to the floor, and conference reports as well. I had a chairman of a committee that I served on once, and he committed candor, so I won't give you his name. He might be prosecuted for candor. That's a sin in Washington, D.C. He had a bill ready right before August recess, and we asked if we could, members of the committee asked if we could get a little peek at that bill because we were going to vote on it when we came back from August recess. And he said, legislation is like roadkill. The more it sits out, the more it gets picked apart. And so we didn't get to see the bill until we came back from August recess. He was being honest. Now, that's the view from inside of Congress. I don't know why a chairman would call his own bill roadkill, but what he's saying, what he's conceding is that when you open a bill up to public scrutiny, the bad things in it will be found. And I'm under no illusion that if you give us 3 months to read a bill, that all of our colleagues will read the bills. I mean, you all are on the Rules Committee. You're probably the most informed of any of the members of Congress because you have to read the bill and know the bill to write the rules for it. But our colleagues aren't going to read all these bills, but their constituents, if we give them 3 days, 72 hours, the bill text goes up, the media can report on it, and then by the third day, we have that vote, and there's a chance to get this feedback mechanism going that is so important in a republic like ours, or democracy, whatever you want to call it, representative democracy. So this is what I'm proposing, and in the spirit of my proposal, I'm giving you a full month to review it before we have to vote on it. And the objections that I expect to encounter will actually be from the majority, regardless of which party is in the majority, because the argument will be from the majority that, oh, you're making us go to the minority side of the aisle, you're making us go over there if we want to pass legislation quickly, and we worked really hard to get the majority and to get this power, and we're not going to give any of it up. But I would suggest to the majority that if we take the high road, America will be better off, the institution will be better off, and we'll produce better legislation, and we can set an example. If we buckle up and do this for 2 years, regardless of who has the majority next time, it'll be hard to undo this because the American people will get used to it, and they will demand that, maybe we don't read the bills, but we have time to read the bills, that they have time to read the bills before we take action on the part of 750,000 constituents back in our district. So I urge the adoption of this amendment, and thank you for indulging me.
Well, thank you all. Thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Joyce, I haven't really thought much about your proposal, but I don't think it sounds okay to me. I don't know what the Ethics Committee, some people get into these jurisdictional, it's my turf, but I think simplifying the, processes and rules and regulations around here, I think everybody would appreciate very much. And so, we can see, and I appreciate the kind words about the McGovern rule, the 72-hour rule, and I think precisely because of what you just said is why we instituted it to begin with, and 90% of the bills considered pursuant to this rule in Congress have complied with that rule. So contrary to mythology that it is it's the other way around. I mean, that's just the way it's been, and I hope that you will be successful in persuading the new majority to keep the McGovern rule in place. And if you have a real problem with the 10% that we waived it on, and you want a better record by the Republicans, that you will press the leadership here to do that. I don't regret the few exceptions either that we had to waive the rule to move bills to the floor quickly to deal with emergencies like the infant formula emergency, for example, or Russia's unjustified war against Ukraine. And as I've said many times before, there are also some bills that no one needs that long of a time to review, but providing a few extra days to resolve any disputes or to answer any questions, I think is important. I also agree with you that we can have a 720-hour review process, and that that doesn't mean members are going to read the bill. I don't know whether you have read the bills that we brought up before the Rules Committee today for consideration this week, but they've been available for over 72 hours. I'm willing to guess that you haven't, but that's okay. So again, we have I hope that the new majority will keep the McGovern rule in place. If, 90% is like an A, right? A minus. You want an A plus, then that's something you ought to strive toward. And I hope that we can, and I'm happy to be supportive of that. Yeah.
If I may, in the 10% where you had to subvert or short circuit the 72-hour process, I think there are cases in there where you may have had 2/3 of the vote, and this wouldn't have been a hindrance. I think on most of the Ukraine votes, it got 2/3.
And maybe and these guys will have to weigh that and decide whether that's the right thing to do. I'm not here to speak against that, but I'm just simply saying that we have tried to change this so that members have more time, because you were right. Previously it was 3 days, and you could count at 11:59 p.m. as one day, and then you could vote on it at 3 in the morning on the third day, and so no one has time to look at this stuff. I just will also say, and this is not necessarily a rules change, but it is a cultural change or an attitude change, is that, I don't think that every single bill has to have a roll call vote. There are some bills that we know are going to pass 435 to nothing, non-controversial post office bills, or something that is, it's not terribly earth-shattering. Sometimes it's like less than a paragraph, and yet to demand votes on everything cuts into committee work time, and a lot of the best, most important work that is done here is done in committee, and it creates this kind of hostile attitude. And by the way, I say that not just as a Democrat who have been subjected to endless roll call votes by some of my Republican friends, but I know a lot of Republican members who come to me and say, why don't you fix that in the Rules Committee? Because they too want to spend their time debating important legislation in committee. And so, I think if everybody has the attitude of that our job here is to govern, is to get stuff done, and sometimes disagree when we don't agree on things, but just move the process forward, I think things could be a lot better here. But, anyway, but I appreciate everybody being here, and I appreciate your recommendations. I look forward to this rules package being put together. I'll say one thing that I did, when I was first became the chair, is I went around to all the different caucuses, not only talking to Democrats, but also to a lot of Republicans, and solicited their input. And we actually had a bipartisan vote. We had a few Republicans actually vote for the rules package when we first passed it, which is unprecedented. We had some stuff in there like the consensus rule to bring bills to the floor. Someone suggested that we ought to modify that so that it's revenue neutral. That's something we ought to talk about. Or so we have an offset on big spending bills. This modernization committee, the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion, all those things kind of came out of discussions I had with people on both sides of the aisle. And so I hope that the process in the next few weeks, follows, that example. I'm not saying we did everything perfectly. I'm not saying that, there were things that I would have liked in our rules packages that couldn't sell to everybody. But again, you're being here, you're presenting these ideas, I think is very constructive. So, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for sharing their valuable ideas with us. And Mr. Chairman, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert statements from Representatives Boebert and Stube into the record on their rules suggestions, and I'll yield back.
Yeah, and let me ask unanimous consent to insert into the record statements from Representative Jackson Lee and Chairman Grijalva. Chairman Grijalva's statement is in support of remote committee proceedings, which I want to state for the record. I have heard from several members that remote proceedings and committees have been helpful in obtaining witness testimony without the worry of travel or cost to the taxpayer. So without objection, Mr. Torres. Mr. Reschenthal. Mr. Perlmutter.
Just a couple comments. So, Mr. Joyce, on your ethics review, absolutely agree. I think we're up to 600, 700 pages of ethics provisions. And there are some things that are going to be needed, and there are going to be some things that I think this commission or this group will find are redundant or confusing, need to be cleaned up. And so absolutely agree with that. Ms. Kamek, the thing I wanted to say to you and Mr. Massey, so in any Congress, probably the two most important votes you make are one for the Speaker and two for the rules package. Because the rule, in this last Congress, for me, the three most consequential votes I've ever taken in my life, and I voted on a lot of things, the Speaker, the rules package, and the certification of the presidency of that. And the reason being, and I think, our experience, you all are going to want to do this differently, I imagine, but you should learn from our experience. With a very tight majority, those rules are particularly important. And for us, the ability to operate during COVID by taking advantage of technology, and I know that you're probably going to reject any kind of proxy voting or remote voting, even for committees. You ought to think twice, especially about the remote voting and the ability to use witnesses remotely. It just allows you to conduct business around here in a way that's in the 21st century and not in the 18th century. And so the 72-hour piece is really, important, but on the other hand, I'm going to tell you, you're going to have some emergencies where that's not going to be available. To your point, then 2/3 of the people ought to be able to move something forward. So I appreciated all your comments, but particularly every Congress needs to really understand their rules package, because outside of the election of the Speaker, it is the most important vote you're going to take. And with that, I'll yield back.
Ms. Fishbach. All set. Mr. Morelli.
I do. I just have a couple of thoughts. First, I agree with you, Mr. Joyce. I've actually I think last week, the week before, did one of the required ethics trainings. And every time I go through it, I scratch my head about certain provisions that I think to myself, to give you an idea, I have a very well-known food cupboard in my community, not-for-profit, 501c3. They're doing a food collection. I think I was told I couldn't put a basket in my district office because that violates the House rules. It's like, okay, I don't know what possible benefit that gives me by having. So, it's a small, silly example, but there are so many times when I'll say, that's an ethics violation, but this isn't. So without any prejudging what the results would be, I think it's incumbent upon us, particularly since you cite social media and some of the things that were not around probably when the original, maybe even the current ones were written. I think really it does behoove us periodically to look at what our ethics standards are and to think about, does this make any sense? And who is it intended to benefit? Who is it intended to, what is the intent of this? So and it's funny, I had this list of proposed amendments and I had written yes next to yours before hearing you speak, so thanks for offering that. I would certainly support it. Sort of curious on the 72-hour issue. So part of this is based on my experience in the state legislature. So in New York, we had a rule, if a bill was introduced on a Monday, it would have to have what we call the order of third reading, first reading, second reading, third reading, and you couldn't vote on it until Thursday, similar to the 72-hour rule. But in our legislature, if a bill was amended, the clock started again. So an amendment changes the nature of the bill, right? If an amendment's agreed to, the bill is different than the original form. And every single time you amended a bill, it had to go through another 3-day waiting period. The only way we could get around it under the New York State Constitution is if the governor issued a statement to us that said, you waive the reading. So in an emergency, the governor can do it. I don't think it works well here. You're not going to have the president sign it. But 2/3 in my mind is, so first of all, the question I was going to ask is, if an amendment is passed on the floor that changes the text of the original bill, is there a 72-hour waiting period that you envision then with the new bill before it could have final passage?
I can't speak to Ms. Kamick's text, but my text just takes all of the rules of the existing McGovern 72-hour rule. I'll give you due recognition there.
I hope you'll keep the name if you keep the.
We might just change it to govern.
Okay.
But it'll be a nod to your chairmanship and your great contribution to this rule. But so it was, how does the existing 72-hour rule work if a bill gets amended on the floor?
It doesn't apply to that, yeah.
Okay, so it wouldn't apply to that.
Which seems to me then kind of an end around on the whole. I mean, you essentially, because an amendment could be the elimination of every word in the substitute of a new, right? That's what we do when we have amendments in the nature of a substitute. So it's not foolproof because you change effectively by amending the bill. You could change the nature of it. But
you're already looking for a workaround.
Well, I'm just saying it exists. I mean, it's sort of like, you know.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, any fence with a gap in it isn't a fence. It's just like a series of posts. And so, I mean, it seems to me like that's the end around. The other thing that I would say is, while I would struggle to maybe find a way to pierce the 72-hour rule, I think 2/3 of the House is just a bar too high to get over. If you really had an emergency and you had to pierce the 72-hour rule, 2/3 of the members having agreed to it, seems to me that would be such that you might find yourself in a position where you really need to do something and you're not able to because the 2/3 is just too high. So I mean, I think I understand what you're trying to do, but I think the two problems are the 2/3 is too high a bar, and the fact that you can amend a bill and change the text of it really leads you with no 72-hour rule at all. I don't know if you want to respond to that or just acknowledge that I'm right on the second one.
Oh, bless your heart. That's what we say in the South.
I know, that's my friend Louise Slaughter. You say, bless you.
Well, no, and to the point about the 72-hour rule, I know that there's other proposals on the table that go further than the 72 hours. There's, you know, the 3 business days. You have the 72 hours as a whole. You have even less. I'm not saying that 72 hours is the end-all, be-all, but I can't remember the last time that we've had an open amendment process that we could participate in that would actually trigger a situation where that
No, but you
would
could have a
happen.
structure, well, we do a lot of structured rules here where amendments are on the floor. We're voting on amendments all the time. If you were to adopt 3 or 4 amendments, it might dramatically change the underlying text of the bill, in which case there's no waiting period for that. You're going to move to immediate passage, which seems to me sort of defeats the 72-hour rule.
I would ask this. Please adopt the amendment, and we'll see if that's a problem. If it is, we'll take your recommendation and clamp down on that loophole.
I second the gentleman.
Well, I mean, the way to do it, to address it would be anytime the bill's amended, it starts the clock again. I'm just not sure people want to do that. That is the way to guarantee you have 72 hours. You'd still have the question of how to pierce the 72-hour rule if you had a real emergency, you needed to get it done. And to that point, I think 2/3 is just too high a bar. It's a standard that you'd almost never be able to achieve.
But to the point that Mr. Massey was making about the 2/3 rule, and Chairman McGovern, you were saying, you know, there were situations where the 72-hour rule had to be waived, and Ukraine was one of the examples. 2/3 of the conference voted in support of those pieces of legislation. So I think that your point about the 2/3 is actually far more viable than what you've stated. So
What did I state?
that it wouldn't be, that it's too high of a threshold.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, there's certainly some instances where you could reach it, but I think there's many times one side might view it differently. But I acknowledge it.
I mean, if it's truly an emergency situation, 2/3 of the majority, of the conference
Well,
shouldn't be a problem.
Well, you could just,
when I wrote this amendment, I anticipated we'd have 60% of Congress, the big red wave, and I wanted to make sure it would be bipartisan, so I thought we should set it at 60.
you could always have a waiver of the leader of the other side,
Well,
which doesn't require 2/3, but just waives the,
I don't trust the other
72-hour
side
period.
any more than I trust our leaders.
well, there you go.
Well, and if I may, I just want to say, I do appreciate the remarks that you've made about some of the ethics recommendations today. When Hurricane Ian rolled through, I
immediately tried to do a
Right.
supply drive of simple things like food and
No, you can't do
water
it.
and basics. We couldn't do it,
Right.
which is absolutely absurd. So there's a lot of things that I think we need to fix within the ethics rules, and then also to your point about diversifying Congress. I'm married to a firefighter, I come from a very blue-collar, working-class family. If we're gonna develop more talent within the ranks of Congress, we need to be able to provide an environment that people can do that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're gonna have one group of people that are independently wealthy that can do this job. So I appreciate your remarks.
Well, I appreciate y'all being here and your thoughtfulness, and I'll,
And let me just say, let me, just two final things. One is, the 72-hour rule is a good rule, and to the extent that, it needs to be waived, it should be sparingly and for emergencies. And if you guys decide that you want a vote to be able to waive it, that's up to you. But the idea of giving people really not, 3 days in, midnight, 11:59, that's one day, and the next day, and then, 1 a.m. in the morning, and that's your 3 days. That doesn't work. It should be 72 hours. Like, for example, the rail bill that we're dealing with today, where no matter where you stand, I mean, we don't like where we are, but it is an emergency. I mean, so, I mean, there's an example. I don't know whether we get 2/3 to be able to, to bring it to the floor earlier, but whatever. But putting that aside, let me just say one other thing. A number of people have talked about these single-issue bills, bringing bills to the floor. They're just on one particular topic. My experience here is that life is complicated. And if you really want to solve a problem, sometimes it doesn't fit into this neat little silo. I do a lot of work on food insecurity and hunger. Right, I'm on the Agriculture Committee, right? But to solve that problem is not just SNAP. It's not just our food and nutrition programs. It's other things too. And it's housing. It's whether people have a job, whether people get paid a decent wage. So sometimes these issues intersect with a whole bunch of other issues. The Farm Bill in and of itself you can't really say that's just one topic. It covers a whole range of things. Right. Not just aid to our farmers, but it covers our food and nutrition programs. It covers a whole bunch of stuff. So I get this idea that, people want to kind of simplify things and make things easier to digest, for people who may be watching. But if you really want to solve some of these problems, sometimes it requires bringing in other topics. Again, not to confuse things, but to actually effectively legislate and get something done. I mean, otherwise you're talking about, doing 9 different bills for what you could do 1 bill for. So as you figure out with your leadership how you narrow down these topics, I mean, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that, solving problems doesn't always fit into one nice, neat little discrete category. It involves a lot of different things. And again, the bills like the Farm Bill is an example. It's multi-topics. And so anyway, anybody else have any?
I just want to, I'm sorry.
Speak on his amendment.
I just want to, I was going to close before I yield, just to say that on I actually think that the 72-hour and a period of time for members to look through and have ample opportunity, I think it's a great idea. I just wanted to raise a question about how you trigger when you need to pierce it, but I think it's a great idea, and I yield. Sorry.
I just want to thank Mr. Joyce for offering his amendment. I think the American public would be appalled if they saw our ethics manual. I mean, it looks like it was written with a typewriter. It's so old, predates the internet. It's got conflicts, and the real ethics manual isn't really compiled. It's like a bunch of emails and addendums and hearsay. Like, we're operating under hearsay. Somebody needs to take all that, compile it, and do a new ethics manual. And it conflicts with some of the other stuff like House admin. So I would just speak in support of his amendment to update that manual.
Mr. Torres had a...
Yeah, I just want to say how much I've appreciated this, I wouldn't call it debate, but this back and forth, everyone using their indoor voice and everybody respecting each other's opinion. And I really hope that, today's meeting of members' input can really set the stage for how we conduct ourselves moving forward. I really appreciated the three of you, or appreciate the three of you being here today and how we have exchanged ideas. Thank you.
Any other questions to this panel? Hearing none, you are free to go. Is there any? Yeah. On the safe banking bill? Are there any other members who wish to testify on the rule change proposals? Seeing none, that closes our Members' Day hearing. All right, now what do we do here? No, no, yeah. So without objection, the committee stands in recess subject to call of the chair. We're not quite ready yet, but we will probably meet here before votes. Yeah, like an hour or so. Yeah, that's our hope. Do you have organizational votes at 5? Committee will come to order. Before we hear a motion, I want to explain a few items in the rule. First, let me take a moment to explain H-Con Res 119, which is a separate resolution that we will debate and vote on after we consider the rail strike bill. They will both be sent to the Senate. The resolution would basically amend the rail strike bill to add paid sick leave for workers, which many of us have been advocating for. By sending it as a separate resolution, we're giving the Senate the ability to take it up in addition to the main bill. But if they don't have the votes to pass it, they can still send the bill averting a rail strike straight to the President. I'm optimistic that they will be able to pass both items, but the fact is that we can't control what the Senate can and cannot pass, and we do not have the time to send this bill back and forth while they figure it out. We need to do this as quickly as possible because they'll start canceling trains a few days ahead of the December 9th deadline. As I said, I'm hopeful that Congress can ensure paid sick leave. I've seen some positive comments from Republican senators this evening, but in the event that they can't, this will give them the tools they need to get the bill to the President's desk as quickly as possible. We are also deeming as adopted H-Con Res 118, which authorizes the use of the rotunda of the Capitol for a ceremony to present Congressional Gold Medals to the Capitol Police and others who bravely protected the Capitol on January 6th. Finally, I'd also like to note that this rule deems as adopted a resolution naming the Cannon House Office Building Caucus Room after Nancy Pelosi, the first woman ever elected to serve as Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. Speaker Pelosi's election was a historic moment for the women of this country, a moment for which they have been waiting for over 200 years. When she took the gavel, Speaker Pelosi noted, and I quote, "Never losing faith, women waited through many years of struggle to achieve our rights. But women weren't just waiting, women were working. Never losing faith, they worked to redeem the promise of America that all men and women are created equal." I'm so proud of the example Speaker Pelosi has set for young women across the country, young women like my daughter Molly, who looks up to her as a role model. Naming the caucus room in the Cannon Office Building after Nancy Pelosi will serve as a reminder to all of our daughters and granddaughters and sons and grandsons that the sky is the limit and that no position in this democracy is out of reach for anyone who works hard and dreams big. At this point, I'd like to yield to my ranking member, Mr. Cole, before we yield to Mrs. Torres for a motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And as you know, I support the underlying legislation, but I'd be disingenuous to say I'm more than a little confused about what we're doing here. President has asked for Congress to pass this agreement as is, without any changes, and yet we're considering a rule that includes an enrollment correction that makes a major change to the agreement, against the request of the President and against the negotiated agreement that both railroad management and labor union negotiators have agreed to. So I'm not exactly sure what we're doing here, but that's our concern, and but I remain supportive of the underlying bill, but certainly not the rule.
Well, we're not a rubber stamp, and so we're going to proceed, and the Senate can decide what they can and cannot pass. Again, we've heard some promising comments from Republican senators. We'll see what happens. But at this point, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 3372, the One Stop Shop Community Reentry Program Act of 2021, a structure rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. The amendment may be offered only by the member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, shall not be the subject to amend, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 6878, the Pregnant Women in Custody Act, under structure rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary, now printed in the bill, modified by the amendment printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order the amendment printed in Part D of the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. The amendment may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and the opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in Part D of the report. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 8876, the Jackie Walorski Maternal and Child Home Visiting Reauthorization Act of 2022 under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee printed 117-69 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.J. Res. 100 under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the joint resolution. The rule provides that the joint resolution shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the joint resolution. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule provides that at any time through the legislative day of December 2nd, the Speaker may entertain motions offered by the majority leader or a designee that the House suspend the rules with respect to multiple measures that were the object of motions to suspend the rules on the legislative day of November 29th, November 30th, December 1, or December 2, on which the yeas and nays were ordered and further proceedings postponed. The chair shall put the question on any such motion without debate or intervening motion, and the ordering of the yeas and nays on postponed motions to suspend the rules with respect to such measures is vacated. The rule provides that proceedings may be postponed through December 2nd on measures that were the object of motions to suspend the rules on the legislative day of November 29th, and on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The rule provides that House Resolution 1495 is hereby adopted. The rule provides that House Concurrent Resolution 118 is hereby adopted. The rule provides that during the remainder of the 117th Congress, it shall not be in order to offer a motion under Clause 7C of Rule 22 with respect to H.R. 4521. The rule further provides for consideration of H. Con. Res. 119, providing for a correction in the enrollment of H.J. Res. 100 under a closed rule. The rule provides 10 minutes of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the concurrent resolution. The rule provides that the concurrent resolution shall be considered as read. And finally, the rule waives all points of order against provisions in the concurrent resolution.
Thank the gentlewoman for excellent reading of that rule. And you've heard the motion from the gentlewoman from California. Is there any amendment or discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the motion from the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, we would request the yeas and nays.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Aye. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin. Aye. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross. Aye. Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mr. Rushenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed to. And I will carry it for the Democrats.
And the distinguished lady from Minnesota, Ms. Fishbach, will carry for Republicans.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate your patience, and the Rules Committee is adjourned.